We're now in public session, so I'd like to welcome members.
As we start public session, can I just raise the point as last week with the Secretary-General Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, he said that he was just about to give up to the Minister a consultation paper that would go out to the public on how we meet the new National Energy and Climate Action Plan, and that we would get a copy of it. The Minister says he's seen nothing, and we have got no paper up from the Department. Similarly, we asked in advance of this meeting today that the Department of Transport and Tourism would provide us the range of new projects they're looking at, or new initiatives. Instead, what we're seeing in the presentation we're about to hear is a litany of stuff that's in the National Mitigation Plan, which we know, as the Minister of Mr Naughton himself says, is not working. And I think just for the work of this committee, it's about time that the public service started recognising that they need to provide a service to this committee by being absolutely frank, by providing that trams modelling details so we know what are the options. Our own library research has done really good work in presenting some of the analysis, but they cannot do it blind to what the departments are thinking. And that's what we're seeing so far, and I think that has to stop today.
I know others are indicating, and I'm going to maybe ask for a response on this. Can I just start the formalities of the meeting first, and then we'll come in and I'll take other deputies or senators. So I just want to remind our members and people in the gallery to turn off your mobile phones, put them into flight mode, as they will interfere with the broadcasting around recording services. So I'd like to extend on behalf of the committee a warm welcome to Graham Doyle, Secretary General, and Laura Behan, Principal Officer of the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, Ms Carol O'Reilly, Public Transport Division Department, and Ms Anne Graham, Chief Executive Officer of the National Transport Authority. And before we proceed, I just want to read out some formalities. So I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against a person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And before I ask Mr Doyle to maybe commence with your opening statement, I know Deputy Pringle wanted to come in. Was it on Deputy Ryan's issue?
Yeah, Chairman, just wanted to support what Deputy Ryan is saying, and I think it was clear from the contributions last week that this committee doesn't figure in terms of how the department views the work that they're doing, and I think that's a very worrying development. And you know, and no fault to yourself, maybe it'll be totally different, but I think if that's the view, and that's the Department of Climate Change, so if that's the view of that department who should be in charge of this committee, that's very worrying and leads to be very doubtful as to what work we can actually do if that's going to be the type of engagement that we're going to have from the officialdom.
Okay. Deputy Dooley, on this point.
Yeah, just, I suppose, very simple to ask. We have your presentations, and there's a lot of good information, much of which we're well aware of. So could you concentrate on assisting us today in outlining what needs to happen, action items, and how we get there. The tough questions that we're going to have to answer in terms of recommendations that we make from here. Taking us back through everything that has happened, we kind of know all that, and it's fine. So to make use of the time, if we can take a lot of what you've provided as read, accept that which is of new information, and effectively how we're going to close the gap. How we're going to close the gap in terms of the transportation side of things from yourselves in relation to emissions, and that's kind of if you're not prepared for that, could I suggest, Chair, maybe that you leave it and come back another day? Like, we have a tight slot, we're trying to get through stuff, but we don't want to spend a lot of time going through or rehashing where we're at.
Very briefly, because I think
first contributions at the last meeting of this committee took almost 50 minutes, right? The issue we're dealing with now, there's an order of speakers here, and I would just ask that would be observed. In fairness to all members of the committee, we have a rota here to circulate it. I think this was agreed. And the issues that are now being raised can be raised as the order of speakers are coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Doyle, if you want to maybe respond to that or give an opening statement. I think there are concerns about, I suppose, getting information, new information from this committee in relation to what we have to do in putting together a report by the end of January.
Chair, thank you. Just to say that the Deputy Ryan mentions a request to our department in advance of this. I'm afraid we don't seem to have received that request. In relation to the opening statement, while we're joined here by Anne Graham, who's the Chief Executive of the National Transport Authority, we decided to give one opening statement today, so Deputy Stanley's concerns about taking up the first hour of the meeting certainly shouldn't be the case. Chair, if you'd like me to go through my opening statement, I'm very happy to do that.
Yes, we'll start with that and then we can come in with the members.
The meeting hasn't started. The meeting always starts with the opening statement.
Yes, we're starting there now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're starting.
I think
with
that's what should happen here.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Ireland faces a considerable task to achieve our national policy ambition of transition to a climate-resilient, low-carbon society by 2050. You've heard much evidence on the extent to which combating climate change is a significant national challenge. Climate measures and policies chosen today will have consequences for Ireland for decades to come. This represents an especially significant challenge for the transport sector, both in Ireland and elsewhere, needing to develop approaches to both reducing carbon emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change. Ireland's rising population, our welcome return to economic growth, more people in employment and more goods being transported bring with them an increased number of vehicles on our roads and a rise in the number of kilometres driven. Ireland's economy and society are busy and on the move, presenting the transport sector with various challenges, foremost among them being the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an expanding sector without impeding social progress or economic recovery. Transport is not an end in itself, it's a means for access to jobs, markets, education, health services, cultural interaction and a whole range of other services and amenities that contribute to healthy and fulfilling lives. However, the EPA inventories show a 6% growth in overall non-ETS emissions in 2016. Transport emissions grew by 4%. The progress made in reducing transport emissions by 25% between 2007 and 2012 has been eroded by significant transport demand growth which unfortunately is not yet all being met in the most efficient ways. Transport emissions are only 6% below the key 2005 benchmark level. Furthermore, EPA projections indicate that without intervention, transport emissions could rise between 2020 and 2035, not fall, arising from a growing population, improving economy and rising employment, along with the traditional settlement pattern that engenders and is now underpinned by private car use. With 20% of Irish emissions and as the third largest emitting sector, transport will have to play its part in the national decarbonisation undertaking, requiring a step change in how we travel, how we do business and the types of fuels and technologies we employ. These transport challenges are not unique to Ireland, they are similarly being faced by our EU and OECD partners. The transport decarbonisation pathway must begin with sustained investment in public transport and active travel to improve the quality and capacity of our networks and, where feasible, encourage shift away from private car use. In parallel, we must reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and secure an early and sustainable transition to zero and low emission vehicles. Until these measures can produce meaningful results, Irish vehicle owners and users must have the most efficient vehicles and use them in the most carbon-friendly ways. This requires working with many actors on a series of complementary policy measures requiring a cross-governmental approach. The National Climate Change Mitigation Plan, which the Government agreed in 2017, represents the critical first step in communicating the longer-term national climate vision. Its role is to set out both the challenges to meet Ireland's emissions reductions targets and chart a clear and quantifiable path towards the long-term objective of transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy by 2050. The plan sets out 24 transport mitigation measures with 29 associated actions. They are wide-ranging and focus mainly on three themes: modal shift, particularly to public transport in urban areas, the transition to alternatively fuelled vehicles, and targeted behavioural change. Of course, the mitigating measures outlined in a 2017 plan cannot provide a complete roadmap to achieve full decarbonisation by 2050, but instead realistically represent where Ireland is now and how it can progress towards the ultimate goal of decarbonisation. The plan is a living document, continually being updated as research, policy and innovations generate additional cost-effective mitigation options. Over the period to 2050, the National Mitigation Plan will be supported by a series of complementary government policies and strategies that will support its decarbonisation objectives. Project 2040 is one such initiative, having a pivotal role in clearly establishing a national commitment to the right spatial planning and the capital investment needed to support projected population and employment growth in a sustainable manner. Through Project Ireland 2040, Government is looking to reconcile mobility needs with climate obligations, committing to integrating land use and spatial planning and to encourage fewer and shorter journeys and support public transport, walking and cycling as real alternatives to the private car. To talk about investment in public and sustainable transport, settlement patterns strongly influence how people travel. The provision of sustainable transport options is only realistic when populations are located close to where people work, go to school, shop and socialise. Continued investment in public and sustainable transport is a cornerstone of the Government's transport sector mitigation response. Encouraging public transport use is central to national efforts to combat climate change, air pollution and other negative environmental and social impacts. Public transport needs to provide a realistic and sustainable alternative where feasible to reduce the dominance of the private car. Government is committed to meeting increased travel demand through more public transport capacity and supporting cycling and walking, and the policy has seen some success. In Dublin alone, over two-thirds of all journeys into the city centre are now made on foot, by bicycle or by public transport, representing an increase of over 10% in the last 6 years. In Budget 2018, the process of investing wisely to increase capacity and enhance the range of alternatives to the car was stepped up. Project Ireland 2040 will further build upon this investment. Linking People and Places announced investment of €8.6 billion specifically for public transport. From Metrolink to Bus Connects, Lewis expansion to cycle lanes, the groundwork is being laid for an integrated, diverse transport future. The aim is to link more people to more places while improving quality of life, easing congestion in our cities and doing our part in delivering a low-carbon society. To take the example of Bus Connects, investment in the project being planned could deliver an increase in services of up to 27% and journey time savings of up to 50%, making capacity available and the switch to bus easier, in addition to cleaner, low-emitting buses. Budget 2018 committed over €100 million over 4 years to multi-annual cycling and walking programmes. Further significant investment planned under Bus Connects in Dublin could deliver 200 kilometres plus of improved cycle tracks, lanes and pedestrian facilities. The decisive shift away from carbon-intensive transport will be further underpinned by electrifying more of the rail network and committing to stop buying diesel-only urban buses. By 2023, 500 buses should be converted to low-emissions vehicles. Although public transport accounts for less than 5% of Ireland's overall transport emissions, we recognise that leadership from our public transport area in improving fuel efficiency and climate impact is important. The NDP commits that from July 2019 onwards, we will no longer buy diesel-only buses for the urban public bus fleet. Work is underway on preparing for implementation of this. A Green Public Transport Fund was established to support the uptake of low-carbon, energy-efficient technologies within the public transport sector. The fund is supporting the piloting and uptake of energy-efficient and alternative fuel technologies for PSO operators within the bus fleet and SPSV sector, and will be used to bridge the price differential between such technologies and conventionally fuelled vehicles. We will begin an up-to-date and comprehensive set of vehicle trials later this year to help further inform purchasing decisions for new buses over the coming years. We will test on Dublin and Cork bus routes a range of technologies, including full electric, diesel electric hybrids and compressed natural gas. The trials will consider CO2 emissions, air quality impacts and contribution potential towards renewable energy targets, as well as fuelling and infrastructure costs. To mention the transition to alternative fuels, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and securing an early transition to zero and low emission vehicles is integral to our transport mitigation efforts and offers one of the most cost-effective and feasible pathways to meeting our carbon mitigation and air pollution objectives. This is particularly important outside urban areas where dependence on private car is strongest and where the public transport systems and active travel offer less potential for effectively addressing travel needs. Fossil fuel use has become deeply embedded into our driving culture. We're almost entirely dependent on imported oil. Of the total vehicle fleet, over 45% of vehicles use petrol, while nearly 54% operate on diesel, meaning less than 1% of vehicles are alternatively fuelled at present. Reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and switching to greener alternatives will be essential if we are to successfully decarbonise the sector. The profile of our current fleet reflects the scale of change required. Project 2040 earmarks investments to support the transition to zero-emission capable cars, underpinning a target of 500,000 EVs on Irish roads by 2030. The groundwork for this ambitious target was laid in Ireland's National Policy Framework on Alternative Fuels Infrastructure for Transport, published in 2017. It represented an important step in communicating the longer-term national vision for decarbonising transport by 2050 and set out our ambition that by 2030 all new cars and vans sold in Ireland will be zero emissions capable. Colleagues in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment are working to ensure that access to refuelling or recharging infrastructure does not act as a barrier to the take-up of alternatively fuelled vehicles. The framework sets minimum levels of provision for refuelling infrastructure and common technical standards to permit interoperability. All this provides a supportive, enabling environment for suppliers and consumers and increased confidence and reassurance in our national commitment to the emerging alternative fuel technology market. The Task Force on Low-Emitting Vehicles, established on foot of a programme for partnership government commitment, is considering in a thorough, pragmatic and targeted manner the range of measures and options available to government to accelerate the deployment of low-carbon technologies, especially EVs. The task force is jointly chaired by my department and the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, and its membership includes the key relevant government departments and bodies. Its work was divided into two phases, with the first phase focusing on EVs and its second phase now focusing on other alternative fuels. We consider that the task force is working effectively to assemble and consider the many factors influencing the scale and rate of transition to low-emitting vehicles. An attractive array of incentives has been put in place to encourage motorists to make the switch to electric, and this is supported by an extensive recharging network in which we are again investing in upgrading and expanding. The pace of take-up is accelerating rapidly, with more EVs sold in the first 4 months of 2018 than in all of 2017. July and August saw the highest monthly sales ever in EVs in Ireland. The emissions reductions dividends from the switch to EVs will take time to accrue, but the pathway has now been clearly established. This is the most climate significant transformation in transport, replacing conventionally fossil-fuelled vehicles on the roads. The initial investment required in alternative technologies and supporting infrastructure is admittedly costly, but can help Ireland to adapt more quickly to this inevitable transition away from conventional fuels. Encouraging alternative fuels and technologies also actively sets Ireland on the right longer-term path towards full decarbonisation and cleaner air. Furthermore, these challenges also provide us with many opportunities for additional benefits to our overall health and living standards. New technologies and new fuels offer great potential and reasons to be optimistic. Looking at making the existing fleet less emitting. Meanwhile, we're not ignoring the sizable existing vehicle fleet and the key role played by efficiencies, eco-driving and increased biofuel use in delivering sustained transport emissions reductions. We continue to work hard at EU level, pushing strongly for better EU vehicle efficiency standards for cars, vans and heavy-duty vehicles. This regulatory approach has yielded important efficiencies in the cars and vans sectors already. Setting the next phase of targets for cars and vans and setting new targets for heavy-duty vehicles will be a key component of Irish success in reducing vehicles' emissions in the short to medium term, as our status as technology takers remains unchanged. Biofuels have also played a significant role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transport. The Biofuels Obligations Scheme comes under the aegis of our colleague department, the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. First introduced in 2010, the scheme requires suppliers of road transport fuel to ensure that biofuels represent a certain percentage of their national annual fuel sales. The level of obligation has been increased a number of times since the introduction of it, and it is the declared intention to continue to increase it further on a phased basis to 2020. This will not only yield significant transport emissions dividends, but also bring us very close to the 2020 target for renewable energy in transport. In terms of climate adaptation, as well as the measures to reduce transport emissions in line with EU and international obligations, there is also the challenge of building climate resilience within the transport sector. Even if greenhouse gas emissions were to completely stop from today, global climate change would continue for many decades as a result of past emissions. This poses two challenges: the task of ensuring continued services and maintaining infrastructure for roads, rail, aviation, ports and buses, and the need to protect new assets by ensuring that today's design specifications will adequately address tomorrow's infrastructure needs. The first Transport Sectoral Climate Change Adaptation Plan was published in December 2016, developing resilience to climate change in the Irish transport sector. The plan outlines climate research and analysis to guide our journey in future-proofing our vital road, rail, aviation, ports and bus services and infrastructure. Building on this knowledge base, work has started on our statutory adaptation plan for transport. The next step, in conjunction with other key infrastructure sectors, is the identification of critical national transport infrastructure. Important work has been underway across the sector, including detailed risk assessments of critical road and rail infrastructure developed by key transport stakeholders. In particular, I'd note the TII strategy for adapting to climate change on Ireland's light rail and national road network, and Irish Rail's ongoing work developing the Coastal Railway Vulnerability Index. The Department continues to support our frontline actors, transport agencies and local authorities to identify potential vulnerabilities within their operations and consider how these can be addressed. Adaptive capacity to climate change is also being considered as part of ongoing work on Planning Land Use and Transport Outlook 2040, or Pluto as we call it, which is updating the existing framework for transport investment published in 2015. Its work is considering how best adaptation requirements and measures should be reflected in the estimation of steady-state maintenance costs. In terms of the challenge of rising demand, this committee has heard much evidence on the extent to which combating climate change is that significant national challenge that I mentioned at the start. It's clear, as I said, that measures and policies implemented today will have consequences for Ireland for decades to come. EPA projections for our 2030 prospects are sobering. Strong levels of investment for new emissions-efficient public transport capacity have been secured. Investment in cycling and walking is being ramped up. Efficiency standards in vehicles are improving every year. The range of incentives to encourage the EV transition has been convincingly developed, and the proportion of biofuels in petrol and diesel is increasing. All of these efforts are currently being cancelled out, though, by rising demand. Each transport trip now is less emitting than it was before. Nevertheless, emissions are rising, but then every year demands for trips to work, education, shopping, leisure and social interactions rise as population and employment grows. And goods transport in support of exports, increased construction activity and higher agricultural output grows, so the development of policy responses for transport needs to continue and go even further. Decarbonising transport by 2050 will require transformation expected mainly to be achieved through the promotion, deployment and uptake of new technologies and alternative fuels. Alongside technology development, more and better lower carbon public transport, more use of active travel modes, a reduction in the need to travel and shorter journey distances must also play a role. Every sector needs to identify new measures and intensify those already yielding results, and that analysis needs to start right away. The focus must be on early, coordinated action. Ireland's response must involve a whole-of-government approach, be comprehensive and be quickly identified. Collectively, these actions will move us towards achieving the long-term vision of a low-carbon society. It won't be easy, and it will require fundamental societal transformation. But with the substantial investment identified and through the focus given by Project Ireland 2040, we can expect to see changes in the transport sector as it steps up its efforts to reduce its climate impact. Achieving the necessary transport emissions mitigation will require individual consciousness and action by us all. It also requires continuing close cooperation between my department and other key departments across the areas of transport taxation, fuel policy, investment policy, air quality and spatial planning. My department will continue to work closely with all the various actors and their various policy drivers as we seek to secure significant, sustainable national emission savings and ultimately a largely decarbonised economy and society.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to bring in our first speaker, which is Deputy Brian Stanley.
Thanks, Graham, and welcome to the panel here, and from the National Transport Authority as well, or Transport Infrastructure Ireland is now called. Just
NTA.
Okay, I suppose just to start that, obviously, there's over 20% of the emissions is coming, greenhouse gas emissions coming from transport, and the fact that we've had a 4% growth in 2016 alone is alarming. And I suppose the first question I want to ask is, we really need to see a step change here. I mean, we know that, not alone, we're not even going to be within the NASA's roar of meeting our targets in terms of our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for 2020. And, you know, I highlighted this in the chamber here, going back 6 and 7 years ago, that we were going to hit this carbon cliff, and here it is now in front of us. But what I would like to know in terms of the department and in terms of at government level and across departments, that, you know, you outline in relation to the electric vehicles, the changes that are being made. But if you actually look at the graphs that you gave here today, that in the case of 2017, there was 900 new purchases, and there was about 2,600 in the state, according to this graph. That would show that the pace is it's at snail's pace, and I just wonder what's been done to accelerate that. There has been an increase in the grants, in some of the incentives, but the real issue is range anxiety. And would you not agree that that's the case? And what's been done to address that? Because we're way behind Norway, we're way behind Holland. Holland is a lot smaller than Ireland, but it has, it has 20 times more charging points than we have here in Ireland. Norway, 20% of all new EVs sold, of all new vehicles sold are EVs. So, you know, on those issues, what are we doing here about this? And in particular, you might address this issue because this keeps getting sidestepped. The issue of the charging points. The Electricity Supply Board, they erected them, they installed them, and they're running the scheme free, okay? And good for them to do that. But the regulator has said that that can't continue. You know, why can that not continue? And what's the department doing about that to address that particular issue? Because that I believe is the key issue here, or one of the key issues in terms of getting more EVs onto the road. Just in relation to biogas, and again I want you to outline, you know, the steps that are going to be taken now to try and address that huge gap, that huge 19% gap that we're going to hit 1% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and you know what's been done to address the gap in terms of meeting the 20%, which is the minimum we should be meeting. And I mean, you know, as the paper outlines, our greenhouse gas emissions may actually increase in transport at the way things are going. So not only do we not want to increase, we have that big gap to fill as well, and to try and catch up. So what's been done to try and address the issues around, you know, the alternative sources of fuel for heavy vehicles? And in particular, you might address just one claim that the hauliers are making. National Road Hauliers Association, they claim, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, but they claim that there's a new European type engine, high-tech engine. It's up to European standards of, I think standard 6 is the term they use, and they claim that the emissions from those, that they're capturing, you know, almost all of the carbon emissions that would come out of the exhaust pipes of those trucks because of the new technology that's been installed in them. I don't know if the department is aware about that, but obviously if that's good if that can be done, and we need to hear about it, but I don't know. Has there been an assessment on that at government level? And just in relation to the indigenous sources of biogas, what measures are being taken? You know, we have a huge amount of agricultural waste. There is one plant generating biogas. Some of that gas can be used for compressed natural gas for CNG. What progress has been made, and what steps, more importantly, what steps are now going to be taken to increase the use of CNG? I brought forward a paper last year on this to, on biogas specifically, to highlight the importance of it and the potential that it has for the agricultural sector, and also to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And just the other question around biofuels is that it's going to require a lot of land, and there seems to me a perfect storm coming here, in that on one hand, if we're increasing food production, Harvest 2020, increasing the output and everything like that, we've seen the fodder crisis, land is fairly well maxed out in terms of use. In terms of the land to grow this biofuel, what's happening? And I would just highlight to you in this regard, there's a lot of marginal land around where we have the three peat fire stations. Is the ESB and yourselves and Board Namona sitting down, and have you worked out a plan in terms of use of a lot of this land? Because a lot of this land is actually underused, Now, there was a scheme for Willow. It wasn't successful, fair enough. But what has been done in the meantime? What's been done? Is everybody sitting on their hands and hoping this will go away, or just, we'll deal with it tomorrow or the day after? I mean, this is an issue that should have been dealt with 6-7 years ago at a minimum. What's been done in terms of looking at that fairly marginal land in places like North, West Offaly, in Longford and Midland counties, and indeed other counties, where we could be producing biomass, not importing it from the United States. And it's good news that the Bord na Móna project to do that is buried. That was absolutely nuts. The carbon footprint of hauling that across the Atlantic would far exceed anything that oil or even the dirtiest of all fuels, coal, would create. And in terms of the public transport, there's a question with integration, and this is really one that catches the public. What are we doing in terms of having a system like you have in other European countries, where you could even book into a hotel and they hand you a ticket and it takes you around the city you're in for the next week, right? Why can't we have something like that here? Or at least why can't we have a one ticket that brings you everywhere on all transport? And I've heard these questions being asked as far back as 10 and 15 years ago. And people would talk about leap cards and all of that. But we still don't seem to be able to get that. Or a commuter coming in from the country in the morning, maybe coming in 40-50 miles on a train, and they want to get here. We need to make that system a lot more simpler. In terms of integrating, in terms of having transport hubs and integrated transport, public transport as well, we need effective we need parking. If people are going to get here by train, if they have a 40-mile journey to do to get to the capital, or to get to Galway or wherever they want to go, and we want them to get there to do the last 40 miles by train, what are we doing about putting in place parking? And I would highlight to you Portarlington, Portlaoise, Ballybrophy, chronic parking. Portlaoise is impossible to get parking in, or anywhere near the station in the mornings, and there's huge difficulties there, along with an extra cost, so we're charging the commuter, 100 quid a week for their tickets, and then, there's another charge, so much a day then put on to park the car. It's penal. We're not getting people onto public transport if we go that way about it. So people will continue to use private cars and choke up the N7, the N4, the M1, etc. So I'd ask you just maybe to address that. And the other thing in relation to public transport, and this is specifically for the NTA, is that the NTA, and I've wrote to you about this, we need to have, and you did respond to stuff I sent you earlier a couple of years ago in terms of putting in some bush shelters, but we need bush shelters. Go north of the border, and they don't need to be elaborate. They don't need to be 30,000 euros worth. They can be very, very simple, basic ones in rural areas. If you have to stand at a bus stop in Borriston-Street, Castletown, Mountrat, Ballybrittis, or down in Newtown or in Ballylinan in Laois, and wait for a bus to come on a wet morning and be covered, trucks passing and spraying you with rain and everything else. People won't do that, and we have to provide corridors where people can go to a local bus stop, stand there with a level of comfort, at least that they can have protection from rain. If you have the type of heavy showers we're having now, you have a week's rain in 5 minutes. That's the way rain is coming now. And if somebody's standing at a bus stop and if they're soaked through before they even get to work, it seems to be a huge big deal about getting bus stops in place. And one suggestion I would make to the department is, well, for God's sake, you let the local councils do it. Just give the money to the local councils and let them get on with it. That's what happens in every other civilised country. The local councils need to provide the bus shelters on those N7, N78, N77 routes and other routes throughout the state. Allow the local authorities, just trust them. They're capable people, elected by the public. There's officials there, trained officials. Between them, they'll work it all out with the local engineers, where these little bus stops could go. And they don't need to be massive. They just need to be big enough to hold 4 or 5 people in rural areas. And, somebody with a buggy maybe, or somebody with a Zimmer, with a walking frame or something like that. That we try and accommodate people with proper bus corridors in rural areas so they can have some level of comfort and get onto a bus without being soaked through going to work or wherever they're going to. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. I might let you into those questions. Whoever wants to come in first. I know there was a range of questions there. Mr. Doyle.
Yeah, Chair, I might just start. There were some questions at the start just in terms of range anxiety, and I think there were also some questions that touch on the work of the EV task force, which Laura, who's with me today, co-chairs. So I might ask Laura to respond to some of those. There were some questions on alternative sources of fuel, and we will touch on those as well. There were questions on land and biofuels, which might be more appropriate to our sister department, possibly who was here last week. So I'm not sure I can be particularly helpful on those. And we've got the chair of, for the chief executive, Anne, of the National Transport Authority, so I think she could fully respond to the last part of the question. Just in terms of range anxiety, I think yes, the deputy is absolutely correct. I think that is that is a really significant issue. We will see. In terms of electric vehicle use, all projections suggest that where this really creates the biggest impact is still a distance out. 2035 seems to be the point where the really fundamental and exciting change happens. In the meantime, we've got to do everything we possibly can to work with the uptake of the technology that is there and encourage it, and there are a huge range of measures that are there to assist with that. But range anxiety continues to certainly to be an issue, but we are seeing improvements all the time in terms of the technology that is there, and I think we're going to see some significant additional improvements over the next number of years. To date, we've seen a lot of the electric vehicles have been in the sort of the small car range, and not the executive who tends to, or somebody who has to work with long distances. And in Ireland, there's no question that one of our biggest challenges in the transport space, both in terms of just providing public transport, but particularly around the issue of climate change, is our dispersed population. So I think in Ireland, there's no question that range anxiety piece is continues to be a factor, but we do see improvements coming, and over the next number of years, we'll see a step forward. I might just ask Laura.
I asked you specifically about charging points.
Yeah.
Charging points are provided by DSB. This question keeps getting sidestepped any time I ask it. I don't know if anybody else here has got an answer on it. The charging points were provided by DSB, right? But they have been told by the Competition Authority, by the regulator, that they have to offload those, right? So what's going to happen? I mean, what's the problem? Is there somebody from the EU, is the EU Commission standing over us with a big stick saying that DSB can't provide it? If they can't, why can't? That's a simple, straightforward question. You, as Secretary General of the Department, have you asked EU officials about this, or have you asked the Minister what the problem is regarding this? Because this is a real problem. We have met DSB on this a number of times, and they tell us that they want it addressed, and they're happy enough to be involved in providing the infrastructure. So what exactly are the blocks? What are the blocks in terms of the Electricity Supply Board rolling out this across the state? And that we work out a method of funding it. That's, I want an answer to that question.
I'll let Mr. Doyle back in on that.
Yeah.
Deputy, I was actually leading that question to Laura.
Excuse me, yeah.
As I mentioned, Laura's co-chair of the EV task force, so this is something that they have they've been working.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Deputy. Good afternoon, Chair. The issue of the ESB owning the publicly available charging network, you're right, has been a hold up to the development of that infrastructure for a period of time now.
We'll just let her finish her answer, and if you need clarification, I'll let you back in. Okay, thank you.
Actually, it is the case this week that the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, now, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, and it is that department and their minister who has responsibility for this particular policy area in relation to the EV infrastructure, ESB being their agency, and the network of chargers being within the remit of that department. But I understand from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment that just this week the Commission for Regulation of Utilities has published a new decision allowing for the transfer of the ownership of the charging network over to the ESB parent body, freeing up ESB now to invest in the publicly available charging infrastructure. So I believe that particular logjam is now addressed this week. Undoubtedly, that infrastructure needs to be expanded and more investment put in place. Although ESB will now be in a position to invest in it from their own resources, I think it's also fair to say that they will probably be looking for some assistance from government to help with the rollout of the particularly needed fast charger network to alleviate that range anxiety piece that you were talking about in terms of the long distances. I should point out that we hope that charging of EVs will mostly take place at home in people's homes, and that people will avail of the fast charging network for helping them with long journeys. And of course, as the range of vehicles increases, all of the need for that infrastructure should be lessened over time. But it is undoubtedly the case, and it is the responsibility of government to ensure that in terms of helping the take-up of EVs at this point in their development, that we can invest a bit in ensuring that some of that range anxiety can be alleviated.
Was there other questions you wanted to cover?
Other questions, just
well,
the transport. Would you mind to just say a little bit more?
Would you like me to talk a little bit more about the LEB task force? The LEB task force was established by government between the two departments of Communication, Climate Action and the Environment, and the Department of Transport, because it was recognised that EVs are a really significant piece for us on the transport side in terms of delivering the decarbonisation of transport. However, many of the policy levers in relation to EVs don't reside with us, and so it was an attempt to bring all of the government departments who have responsibilities in the area of regulation, infrastructure pricing, incentives, etc., around the same table to tackle in a concerted way the wrinkles and the difficulties that might exist around the system in relation to the deployment of EVs. So, in terms of the work that has done, its first phase has focused on EVs. The Deputy is probably aware that an interim report was made by the LEB task force to the government in advance of the budget last year, and there were a range of new incentives for the rollout of EVs announced at that point in time. Some of them have been introduced by our department, including the tolling incentive, the grant for taxis and hackneys. The benefit in kind incentive was introduced by the Minister for Finance, and there have been a range of further supports put in place by DCCAE in relation to home infrastructure, home charging grants. I think we've seen the results of that concerted action this year in terms of the increased take-up of EVs, which has been, obviously from a very, very low base, and it has been quite disappointing. But we had a very, very generous range of incentives in place to facilitate the take-up of EVs before we even set up the EV task force, but that didn't seem to be enough to trigger a mass take-up because of people's concerns about the vehicles themselves and the range, most likely. However, when we put in place a targeted range of incentives, I think we've seen a very significant response. In the first 4 months of this year, we saw more EVs bought in Ireland than in all of 2017. July and August have been record months for the purchase of EVs. We've 6,500 EVs on the road now. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but from where we were 2 or 3 years ago, that is a significant increase, and that pattern is continuing. So I think there has been a good response to the incentives that have been put in place.
Emission trucks as well.
Yeah, in terms of the freight sector, the Deputy was referring to the Euro 6 standards in relation to HGVs, which the Irish Road Haulage Association, whatever, is absolutely correct in terms of the Euro 6 standard for HGVs is an extraordinarily high standard in relation to air pollutants. It has certainly put in place a lot of technology in order to trap the most harmful particulate matter, NOx, the nasty air quality pollutants that come from diesel vehicles generally. So in that respect, they are a very, very significant development. They've been in place for a few years. However, what's probably most significant in terms of reducing carbon emissions from the HGV sector is the negotiations that are currently ongoing at EU level for the putting in place of a new set of regulations around CO2 and heavy-duty vehicles, where the EU is seeking at manufacturing stage for the first time to put in place a standard which will require full information to be made available to all purchasers as to the carbon outcome of the truck. So however many grams of carbon per kilometre that truck will be capable of achieving when they buy the truck. Now, that monitoring is beginning next year, and from then the EU hopes to be able to secure a reduction every year with setting of targets, specific targets for 2025 and 2030, that manufacturers will be required to produce vehicles that are less emitting. Now, that's by far the most cost-effective way of ensuring that the road freight fleet starts on its decarbonisation journey. The technologies in the HGV sector are not progressing at the same pace as they have been in the cars and vans sector, in the lighter duty vehicles. The deployment of battery technology in particular is not suitable for the most part yet for HGVs, although there are some promising pilots. Hydrogen is slow to develop also in that space. So for us, you're absolutely right. One of the key alternative fuels that we need to start deploying within our freight fleet in the absence of those technologies happening is compressed natural gas, the CNG, and using that then as a pathway to the introduction of biogas in the system. The European Union is supporting Gas Networks Ireland in deploying a range of refuelling infrastructure, which we expect to have 14 CNG publicly available refuelling stations open by 2020. Gas Networks Ireland are working with private fleets in order to allow for refuellers. Phase 2 of the LEV task force, phase 1 looked at EVs, but phase 2 of the LEV task force is now turning its attention to the gases, CNG, biogas and hydrogen, in terms of how we might, again, work with our colleagues in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, the Department of Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform, Department of Housing, Planning, etc., to ensure that the system examines fully what incentives might be needed, but also what impediments might be in place within the system in order to allow us to move forward in those gaseous fuels, that space which I think we've managed successfully to do in terms of EVs. So that's where that is at the moment.
Next to answer the questions in relation to bus stops, parking, train stations. Yeah. Thank you.
So 3 particular questions. One on integration of fares, and Lahart does provide integration across all public transport. The only area where you can't use Lahart is in intercity rail travel, but for any subsidised bus service, including bus errand services, it's now available on all of those services, all city services, all commuter rail services. We do have a visitor leap card that we have put in place in Dublin only. It is only for Dublin, but it does allow a ticket to be bought by a visitor to Ireland before they come, which allows travel across all modes in Dublin. In terms of transport hubs, yes, we are looking at additional parking at train stations. We're working closely with Irish Rail to identify where we can put additional parking where they own property and move on that as quickly as possible. Funding has been the constraint in that space, but in terms of payment for parking, one of the issues that if you do introduce free parking, you may find that the parking is used for other activity rather than actually for train journeys, or for people that are using it for train journeys. So we think there'll have to be some charge associated with parking at train stations. Bus shelters, we know we have a complete under provision of bus shelters right across the country, and also particularly in rural areas. So again, the constraint was funding, and we will be happy with the additional funding that we believe will come forward to really up our provision in terms of bus shelters. And we'd be delighted if local councils do take on this activity, and if they provide and work through the planning and identify where the sites are, it will certainly speed up provision, and we'd be happy to work closely with local authorities to deliver more bus shelters.
Deputy Stanley.
Just one point, Chair, on that, just in relation to the parking, that of course if there's nothing on the car saying that the owner has paid for parking or is permitted to park, it will allow some abuse of those car parks, particularly in the larger towns like Portarlington and Portlaoise. But it's very, very simple. When you buy the ticket for the train, you're given a small disc and you put it on the car. There's ways around that. But it's just commuters who are heavily taxed, paying $100+ a week to get into the city, be it whatever city, 40-50 mile journeys. They feel this a huge imposition on top of them as well. And just one point on the bus shelters, that with the bus shelters, the problem with the process is too slow on. I know that you have supported some of them and you have managed to get some in place, but the process is too slow. They're big, they're expensive. Something more basic will do. There are simpler models in other countries. North of the border, there are simpler ones that can be erected. I'm not saying that you should put up something that's shabby looking, but small bush shelters can be put up. We can have a design for them, for certain types of towns and villages. Very small ones for rural areas, maybe for 3 or 4 people to stand into, and so on and so forth. Where there's a bigger catchment, like in the likes of, maybe Mount Rod or bigger towns like that, you can have them slightly bigger. That's all I would say to you. Thank you.
Okay.
Would there be a possibility of looking at that idea in relation to the parking at train stations, that an integrated ticket where you buy your train ticket and it includes your parking on it?
We can have a look at that. There is an integrated, in terms of some of the annual passes, as far as I'm aware, where you can buy an annual parking as well at a reduced rate if you are a commuter. So, but we look.
I think that's a very simple way of dealing with that issue, and I think it's something that should be looked at to encourage people to use public transport and not abuse, as you're saying, the parking. I'm going to move on to Deputy Marcella, Corcoran Kennedy. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your attendance here this afternoon to our invited speakers. Can I start off by just asking how realistic you think it is for the government's aim of reducing emissions targets, CO2 targets by 80% in terms of your own role in it? Do you think you can achieve it?
Be an over and back session, if that's okay, for the 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
I think that's the 2050 target, which, as we look at the elements of actually meeting the target, I suppose there are a couple of components. There's the modal shift piece, which we've talked about a little bit. There's particularly technology and standards that we've talked a little bit about. There's the alternative fuels piece and the work with biofuels that has made a huge difference, and there's behavioural change in terms of how we travel, how we drive, if we drive, and most importantly in that space, whether we can replace the need to drive with other modes of transport. I think it's very clear that 78% of emissions in the transport sector are in the space of the private car and heavy goods, or the freight part. I suppose in that time frame we can see the significant technology changes that are scheduled to come on during that space of time. So in that sense, I think it is realistic. I think the difficulty and the challenge that we're finding is meeting the targets in the intervening period. So while we know that those technologies are coming on board and that the longer term vision is achievable and is feasible, I think we will continue to have to work through the challenges of the milestones in the meantime. And I think in many ways that's the hardest part of this.
And in relation to public transport, what are the plans to transition trains, buses to biofuels or electricity? And what are your timelines on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of public transport, it contributes just less than 5% of overall emissions. But it's really important that we use the public transport that we control to actually to show leadership and it's a space where, as I say, it's something that we can directly impact. We've committed on the bus front not to buy any more diesel-only buses by mid-2019, and I think that's a very significant factor. We're now looking at trials in terms of how we get there, and they'll start happening very shortly, particularly in Dublin and Cork. And you might like to say something just in relation to the train piece and the electrification of the network and some of the plans there as well.
So part of the National Development Plan has an investment in the DART expansion programme, which is really looking at the commuter rail lines and a move towards electrifying all of those lines to Drogheda, Maynooth, Celbridge, and to provide in the interim purchase fleet that can run both at either hybrid diesel or diesel electric or a hybrid diesel battery in the interim to kind of build up our fleet and the capacity on the rail lines, that when we have the electrification in place, then can then operate as electric vehicles. So our focus is on looking at the type of fleet that's available now and purchasing those hybrid type of fleet to build up the capacity and then follow on with electrification of those lines.
And just in relation to Dublin Airport and the proposed second runway there, has that been assessed for its potential impact on climate?
I think yes is the answer in terms of the planning process and the need to engage in the various studies as part of that. I can probably give you a little bit more detail. I can send you on some more detail on that if that's helpful.
To the
committee, it'd be great.
Committee, and it can be circulated.
Yeah.
The other thing is just, you were talking about the percentage of emissions from privately owned cars, and encouraging people to transition away from the diesel and petrol. Now, diesel is very widely used across the country, outside of the urban areas certainly. And if people are to transition in terms of the charging units, for example, if you're doing long journeys, a lot of people stop off motorway points or whatever. How is that going to be managed in terms of people, instead of calling in for diesel or petrol, that they call in to charge their car? Now, I did notice recently that I did see one charging unit there, but I mean, how is that going to be managed in terms of those companies, or what incentives? You're obviously examining that. Certainly,
and it's certainly part of the work of the EV task force. So I might ask Laura to respond on that.
Yeah, there are a number of fast charging units that have currently been made available by ESB e-cars under the existing 900 publicly available charge points that there are for EV chargers in Ireland. So you're right, there are a number of fast chargers and slow chargers also, unfortunately, available at the motorway service stops. I think it's clear that we will have to invest more in that fast charging network. I understand that ESB had indicated last week that that they may be making an application to the government's climate fund for assistance to roll out a new fast charging network, and that the climate fund closed for applications on Monday. So we're hopeful that that may be the case.
Oh, very good. And the other thing then is you were talking about how challenging it's going to be in terms of freight and all of that. Have you plans for promoting eco-driving techniques for people and, you know, reducing the speeds on motorways as well as a means of energy saving?
Or the eco-driving you might deal with as well?
Yeah, eco-driving has been tackled for the most part within larger fleets. You know, in terms of an overall energy efficiency approach, when companies, or for example our public transport companies, Dublin Bus, Irish Rail, whatever, all of the drivers and all of the vehicles in the public transport companies would have undertaken eco-driving training, and there are technologies that are deployed within the infrastructure in order to try to secure the most efficient driving. So to date, we've tackled eco-driving as part of particularly large fleets under SEAI programs to do that, and it is true to say that we have been sort of examining how we might scale that up in order to try to consider the behavioural economics piece around private cars and the potential for eco-driving to be deployed by drivers in terms of managing their own fuel consumption. And that's a difficult piece. We've got a study underway at the moment, which is being co-funded by ourselves and the EPA to look at how we might deploy eco-driving in the most efficient way and in the most effective way in order to be able to reach the target audience. Because it's often true that you can spend a lot of money on eco-driving programs and the benefits of them get dissipated within a short time frame as the training that people have undergone slips, so it's a difficult piece to get right on a sustained basis. So we're hopeful that the outcome of the study that we're looking at, which is looking specifically at an Irish context and looking at particularly HGV drivers, could give us some useful information in terms of a programme of scale that we might be able to deploy nationally.
I was very impressed some time ago by the work that Dublin Bus had done in the eco-driving space. I can't remember the percentages, but they were really, really impressive. And now that we talk about that concern that Laura mentioned that we have, that over time the people may revert to where they were before. So there is a sort of a challenge in sustaining it. But I will go back to Dublin Bus to see how that has fared for them over time. But it was certainly very impressive in the first instance.
And as the committees are progressing, we're realising that there has to be a whole of government and a whole of society approach to this. What kind of engagement do you have with other departments? Is it a kind of a project basis engagement, or is it consistent?
I think there's a consistency around this. There's a huge amount of cross-government work now on a range of issues. I seem to spend a huge amount of my time now attending cross-government meetings, which is excellent because it gives us the opportunity to directly work with our colleagues where issues cross over. And there's no question that climate change as an issue is now on the top of people's tongues in the way maybe it wasn't a number of years ago. So we see that cooperation quite regularly. There's a good structure in place. I suppose a significant change was to bring the issue of climate change directly under a particular government department, and I think that's a significant change. There's a cabinet committee, there's a senior officials group, there are climate change units within various government departments, and I can certainly see that work and that interaction being more positive than it's ever been.
And finally, do you have any communications strategy for, reaching the citizen effectively, or haulage companies or whatever, to encourage them? So for example, if we want people who are driving diesel cars to change to EV vehicles, or whatever, how, do you have a communications plan to reach people sitting at home in the evening, or, listening to the radio as they drive around?
Yeah, I think it's probably on a measure by measure basis. So particularly around the issue of EVs, for example, I think it's dealt with in that way. But it's actually a very fair point. Maybe we should look at an overall communication strategy in this space. So that's something we'd certainly take away and look at.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Deputy Chambers next.
Thanks, Chair. And try and keep brief. Just first question relates to electric vehicles, and you mentioned that 6,500 was as a result of concerted action. I'd respectfully disagree. I think we're really going at a snail's pace compared to some other countries, and I'd like to see maybe what your ideas are around accelerating progress in this area. If you look at Norway, for example, half of all cars sold were electric vehicles last year. And over half this year will be electric vehicles. We're way behind what other countries are doing in this space. And I think, even Mr. Doyle, you mentioned that the real action will happen around 2035. I think that shows a lack of ambition around trying to accelerate progress around this. I think we need a much greater ambition and to try and match leading countries in Europe and elsewhere on this, so that why can't we replicate what Norway has done, for example? They had some very good, I know Marcella Corcoran Kennedy mentioned, how do you communicate this? I think it'll happen around certain incentives. I know Norway piloted a tolling model, so you got reduced tolls or free tolls for electric vehicles. Can you not do something around that for a short period to try and drive change, or have a reduced toll fee? I know there's contracts or whatever with that, but I think we need to really accelerate policy actions, and I think we've been way too slow. It's not your own direct, you're trying to obviously drive policy in this area, but I think we need more ideas about. Maybe you can enlighten us on what other European countries have done, obviously with the example of Norway, or what we can do in the tax space to try and really drive electric vehicles. Because as you mentioned, 20% of greenhouse gas emissions are transport related, and half of that is private cars. So if we can replicate Norway, an oil country, what they've done in the electric space, we can massively reduce our carbon footprint very quickly. And I think we need to be really innovative around solutions around tax, so people can actually see the behavioural change there. And I think, our actions thus far don't match what other countries have done. So that's just my first point. And maybe you can answer that. Just around the capital replacement of our bus and rail fleet. Can you give us some indication about when we'll be replacing the existing stock to try and reduce our carbon footprint there, or what's the capital replacement model you have in place, and how that will impact on carbon emissions? I know you mentioned in your statement about park and ride facilities and trying to encourage commuters to use our train lines. I'd respectfully say, for example, some of the decisions by the NTA around Dunboyne Station, for example, you've implemented a new charging system where there used to be loads of cars parking there. There's now none, because of your prohibitive model of parking. So it completely contradicts the climate change approach. And I think, like Deputy Stanley mentioned, you need to have a model of, whether it's integrated ticketing with parking. I'd argue that your current charging system for parking is actually is reducing the number of people who'd use commuter trains. And for example, you've also allowed planning applications to be progressed. Take Broombridge train station or Lewis station, for example, that's integrated with trains. That's a new station without any parking, no provision at all. And you're going to have electrification of the line through there. Another new trade station in Pelletstown, very little provision for parking, and a massively negative impact on people who live around those areas. So whilst we're talking about park and ride facilities, the impact on the ground in suburban Dublin is the opposite. And when you have a charging model that you have in policy terms, you're actually you're not helping the potential commuter or the existing one, and you're not helping the people who want to live in residential areas where you're developing train stations. So I'd like to hear more about actual park and ride facilities and what you're doing in that space, because at the moment you're giving out tenders to private clampers who are punishing people who want to commute, and I think we need a much more positive model of park and ride facilities to actually help commuters. Also, I'd like to know around I know there's been good changes around integrated ticketing, but I'd like to know what you're doing around trying to have a cashless. I know the Netherlands, for example, has a cashless model with say e-cards. Also helps around. I think a lot of public services should transition to that. What are you doing to try and have a cashless payment system? And also, I suppose, on the Bus Connects issue, Bus Connects is dotted throughout. I think it's important that the Department and the NTA are cognizant of the democratic decision of Dáil Éireann around Bus Connects and the rejection of the current proposal and the request for the reversal of many of the routes. There's a lot of spin around 27% increase of services. If you look at suburban north and south side of Dublin, people see the opposite of that. A lot of services are being very, very much adversely affected and are being rejected by people who live in those areas. So I'd like to know as well, what were the terms of reference for Bus Connects? And perhaps you could enlighten us on your advertising spend on Bus Connects specifically, where there seems to be a very direct and aggressive campaign to fool people in suburban Dublin about what you want people to believe Bus Connects is, when they actually can read the maps and see the real impact of it. And I'd like to hear what you're doing around radically changing Bus Connects as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. I might bring in Anne Graham first to deal with some of those questions in relation to Bus Connects and respond. Yes.
Well, just first to clarify for Deputy Chambers that we don't set the charges for parking at rail stations. That is Irish Rail, for Irish Rail to do. Obviously, we look with them at the policy around charging at stations, but in actual fact it's their land and they set the charges for car parking. We don't set those charges. Also, it's their responsibility about clamping and relation to companies for clamping.
But sorry, you set the overall policy around rail procurement and everything else. So surely you have a policy direction to Irish Rail, because when we speak to CIE, they say the NTA are the bosses. So surely you have some policy direction.
We don't own the rail stations, and they are owned by
so you've no
CIE.
charging. You've nothing to do with charging.
The charges are set by Irish Rail, but obviously we engage with them because it impacts on how people use public transport.
Do you have a view on the matter?
But if we go and look at the way the numbers in terms of passengers using Irish Rail, the growth on our public transport, including Irish Rail, is very significant. So at the moment, it doesn't seem that car park charges are having an impact on the number of people that are using rail in commuter.
And as the Chief Executive of the NTA, do you support the charging at parking stations?
But of course, if we wanted to encourage people to use public transport, we would always look at charges, because that's one of the things that impacts on how people use public transport. So of course, we would obviously like public transport to be free, but we're not in that space. There's obviously has to be charges associated with public transport in order that we can pay for the public transport that is provided by the state. In terms
what about new train stations which you are developing?
I'm just going to answer your questions related to that, Deputy. So there was two questions you asked. One was around Pelletstown Station and the other around Broome Bridge. And those stations are located very close to the city centre and in what would be considered suburban Dublin. And really, we don't encourage people to drive to a station where it is very located quite close and within the city centre. What we would try to encourage is people walking and using public transport and cycling to those stations. So as part of trying to encourage more people to use sustainable transport, one of the things that you would do is not provide parking at particularly stations that are located within the city region. And so that's how you would make the interchange. You make interchange by people walking, cycling and using public transport.
And what about the residential areas that are adversely affected as a result of the decision by the NTA not to forget about parking around those stations? Do you have any? Do you talk to people who live in these communities?
What we would try and do is encourage the users of public public transport not to use cars to travel if they can and if there's an alternative for them. And in these locations, in terms of Palestine of the future and also in Broombridge, there are other means of getting to that rail station. In terms of integrated ticketing, we are looking at the next generation of LEAP, which we're calling next generation ticketing. It's account-based ticketing. It is looking at moving towards cashless payments and looking at an account-based and using your bank cards and other means of payment for public transport. We have started by part of that is moving to using your mobile phone for booking certain tickets, and we have a procurement underway relating to that. And we'll be moving to put in place validators where you can use cashless payments, or using your cards payment onto public transport. I haven't got the timeline for that. We want to move as quickly as possible in that space. In terms of Bus Connect's programme, we believe that we did present the benefits of Bus Connects to the public, and we weren't being disingenuous by saying that there would be 20% increase in services across the region. It was very carefully calculated what that would be, and that was what was presented to the public. We also said that there was, in terms of the impacts of the network proposal, it did propose additional interchange, it did propose additional orbital services and additional services, but there were changes associated with the current network. And what we've asked the public is, are you prepared to make changes to the network in order to achieve the type of service improvements that we believe would come from the Bus Connects network? I don't have the full advertising spend in terms of Bus Connects, but I can certainly make that available to the committee. But one thing that Bus Connects will bring, we believe, in terms of the network and also the improvements in terms of bus corridors, is improvements and more efficient public transport, which we believe would reduce carbon emissions for our public transport.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Laura Behan. There was just a few questions in relation to electric.
Just before,
yeah, absolutely.
Would you mind if
yes.
Deputy Chambers just had a couple of points at the start, which led into the to the EV piece, which Laura will answer. Just to say, in terms of my mention of 2035, that's an internationally recognised sort of time frame, right? That's not something I'm saying. So just and I've made clear that we're very anxious to try and do all we can in the intervening period to get there faster. So I just wanted to be clear about that. I think you mentioned, for example, tolling in Norway, and that's something that we've already done it, and we already have a scheme in place. And just on the good point in terms of what can happen in the tax space around this, and in terms of incentivising. I mean, if we go back to when the way motor taxation was calculated some time ago, we saw a massive behavioural shift in terms of that. Now, of course, these days we're looking at lots and lots of diesel cars, and we're looking at a different problem from CO2 in terms of air quality. But we can see the power of that. So it's certainly a point well made. But Laura can answer your other questions.
Just in relation to you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't in any way pretend that 6,500 EVs on the road is something to be celebrating with alacrity. It is, but I have to say that this year, in terms of the demand for EVs within the Irish market, in response to the incentives that were put in place in the budget last year, has shot up. In fact, the constraint on the purchasing of EVs this year has been the lack of availability of stock. Now, the car dealers can't get the stock in quickly enough to meet demand for EVs and plug-in hybrids this year in response to a significant step up in demand, which we do find encouraging. A part of the reason why that stock isn't available to us is because of the success of Norway. Unfortunately, they are taking up quite a sizable amount of the overall EU production of electric vehicles. we wish we could emulate the range of incentives that have been put in place in Norway, but the cost for that is running at over $1 billion already within Norway, and yet, despite the range of incredibly generous incentives that have been put in place at a very, very sizable cost, only 50% of new vehicles being purchased in Norway are EVs. Just to put that into the context of the kinds of incentives that we would require to put in place in Ireland to achieve what Norway has done in relation to EVs. Yeah, Graham's already mentioned we did introduce the tolling incentive. We introduced it on the 1st of July this year. There's a 50% reduction at almost every toll in the country for full battery electric vehicles, and a 25% reduction for plug-in hybrids. So you just get an EV toll tag, and that you just pay half tolls. So that's and we're delighted with that. We do hope we hope that it is contributing in some part to the increase in demand for EVs in the place. You were talking about, when you mentioned cashless, and you were talking about it in the EV space, I suppose it's probably worthwhile to point out that all the electricity to fuel electric vehicles from the public recharging network is currently free. It's totally cashless already.
That must be the Ryanair thing.
No, that's fine. That's it, really. It is
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Deputy Timmy Dooley.
Well, thanks very much. Could I just welcome the presentations? And I think just listening to your presentations, it's very clear the difficulties that you have as an independent department to try and coordinate the issues. So I have some considerable understanding of what Ms. Behan has to try to do to pull all sides together and to try to get a coherent policy framework in place. I've raised the same kind of issues with representatives from the Department of Communications, and again, they're just not in charge of all the policy elements. And there's no doubt that individual departments will have their own concerns and issues and their own responsibilities. So what I suppose I'd like to hear from you, Mr. Doyle, is to try to understand what delineations can be moved, what movement in terms of responsibility around certain areas. It seems somewhat bizarre that, you know, just because the Department of Communications has responsibility for the generation of electricity, that necessarily the network or the charging points should necessarily reside there. If that was a function of your department under transport, that you may be able to deploy some policies that would ensure that the charging network was built out more fully and more quickly, because I absolutely concur with what Deputy Stanley would say. I regularly hear from constituents, for those that actually have made the shift to electric vehicles, a number have come to me recently and said their next purchase will be a hybrid. So they're going back, quite frankly, because the charging points are not available, the fast charging points are not available, they're not being policed or managed to the extent that they should be, other people's parking in them, and they've been broken down on occasion. Now, when I question the ESB and others, they say, well, for the number of vehicles that we have and what we propose, it's adequate. But if you're trying to get people over the range anxiety issue, you really have to front load these things to the extent that people are sick of looking at them around the place, that they're almost, ubiquitous. And then, that helps in the public consciousness that they're not going to be caught out. And yes, for sure, and when we've met with the automotive sector, and they're bringing on more electric vehicles, and the range is improving, and that car class issue that you talk about is being addressed as well. So at some point you're going to reach a tipping point where there will be a very significant demand. And I'm just concerned that the network of charging is not going to be there to meet that. The incentives are good, they could be better. Others have talked about what has happened in Norway, and we've put forward those policy issues in the past. So it's really imperative that we do something big in terms of giving confidence to the consumer, that we're all about ensuring that they have and are going to have access to the charging network. Because we will never have the issue about charging at home. It's the concern of being caught out somewhere else. The whole issue of parking around train stations, Lua stations, etc., like that entity that's out on the Red Cow junction, I think there should be much greater parking there. For those of us that transit from the country to the city, you know, you can spend an hour just pumping diesel fumes in traffic for that 5 or 6 miles from the N7 through to the city. Even if we were able to get parking there, that contribution alone would be significant and would declutter the city. So I think it's a role of some department, and I get your point, that's owned by CI or that's owned by whoever, you know. Then what I think we should be getting from you, Mr. Doyle, is saying, we'd like to get control of that. So tell us what it is we can do together, with yourselves, working together to reorient that. There's issues around Erin Road, Erin's charging and parking. Like in Limerick, you'll see a sign in the car park that says, you're responsible for your vehicle at night, you're probably better taking it out of here, is what they're really saying, in not leaving it in their car park overnight, because there are certain blind spots and there's break-ins. So, you know, those are the kind of things that I can understand from Erin Road Erin's point of view. If you're on the board or you're the CEO, you have an awful lot of issues to address, and that falls well down the line in terms of their contribution to climate change. So I think we have to find some department that's going to assume responsibility and not just coordination responsibility. Just on a final point, you talked, I think, Mr. Doyle, you said 2019 in terms of when you'll be purchasing, that will end the purchase of fossil fuel diesel only. Like, look, I mean, I could rehash, I've done it at previous committees about the decision to purchase 110 buses last year, Ms. Graham, or whatever. Look, it's done. We can't go back in it. There's no point in me hauling you over the coals about that. But I think we should now be saying from today onwards, use whatever you have, but don't purchase anything. Don't purchase anything else. Don't be setting a date beyond today. Get the best out of what you can. Keep them going until such time as you can get an alternative fuel. Again, and just going back to the fuel, it's not just about the electricity network. We should be looking at the compressed natural gas. You know, if you wait for industry to invest in that, that's going to take a long time. That's going to delay it further. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen in certain areas, particularly in relation to the heavier goods vehicles. Should we be saying, that's expensive, that's expensive technology to roll out, but should we be saying, let's do that? And you know what? Maybe it won't get used for 10, 15 years, and maybe technology will improve, and maybe it'll be redundant. If it helps in terms of moving people in that direction, well then that's the kind of thing that we should be doing.
And just on the Deputy Dooley's question in relation to the buses, do you have a price differential between the cost of a diesel bus and a non-diesel type lower emission? Have you got that pricing for us so that we could maybe understand the costs involved here, and that may have been a reason why you purchased diesel buses, I don't know, in the recent past? Maybe Mr. Doyle, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I suppose, sorry, the purchase, just let me take a note of that. Purchase price differential, okay. Thanks, Deputy Dooley. Just in terms of your first point on coordination, obviously on an issue like a core issue like climate change, there are a lot of actors, there are a lot of players. I think I answered Deputy Corcoran Kennedy earlier on in terms of the coordination across government has improved on all issues, and I would say that with the Department of Climate Action, we have a very, very close working relationship. I know that Laura and her team are weekly meetings with our colleagues over there. I think the EV task force itself was a good example of that. I think we were very anxious to try and get a structure that would allow us to work through those coordination issues, and we were particularly instrumental ourselves in in working with our colleagues to try and get that off and running, and that has made a significant difference. So there is very, very constructive engagement now. And if you take an example, like we've talked about parking at train stations, but equally I know the issue of car parking and charging for car parking where electric vehicles are parked up. Charging has come up, which is obviously an issue within the local authorities, but we've managed as part of the to start looking at how that can be addressed by bringing the local authorities in under one of the work streams in the EV task force. So I think that's significant. I'll let Laura just deal with and that's I'm interested in your point in relation to people going back to hybrid from electric. Those points Laura can certainly address. I think in terms of our investment in buses more recently, and Anne will be able to give the more up-to-date costing on buses. I suppose that the challenge and the choice that we've had in recent years, as the Chair mentioned, is do we want to buy one efficiently fuelled bus and get one busload of people out of their cars, or do we want to buy 3 buses and get 3 busloads of people out of their cars? And I think that's been the challenge to date. Now we're reaching a situation where some of that is balancing out. I would say that the buses that have been bought more recently and that are being bought presently are at the new Euro 6 standard, or not the new standard, but the existing Euro 6 standard, which is a huge improvement in terms of where some of the buses in the fleet were at. So I think that's a particularly important point. I might just let Laura just deal with some of your points around electric vehicles, and let Anne just deal with your points around park and ride. And I know that under the really significant investment that we're looking at, 2.6 billion this year and over the next 3 years in public transport, and 8.6 billion over the course of the National Development Plan. I know that part of the funding that goes through the NTA into the public transport space will actually be deployed around park and ride facilities. So Anne may talk about that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Just in relation to the infrastructure, the recharging infrastructure, my colleagues in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment chaired the Infrastructure and Pricing Working Group under the LEV Task Force, and a really significant amount of work was undertaken within that working group to identify the demand, to identify the stretches of road where we feel that the deployment of fast charging infrastructure is probably most needed. They've worked very closely with the SEAI on that. I do believe that we will see a step change in the EV recharging infrastructure provision, and that will occur over the next year, particularly as the Climate Fund gets deployed and as the ESB investment piece is freed up. So I really do hope that we will see significant progress in that over the next year.
Well, that's very welcome, and maybe just to encourage you to maybe do some advertising around what's happening. Maybe it's something the local authorities can do, because most of what I hear is from people who in a place like Ennis or Ennis-Diamond or Scariff, where they don't see an appropriate fast charging point. In essence, they might never need it.
Yeah.
But it's about this range anxiety, and to get the early adapters. Sometimes it's worth putting in, or maybe over-investing in some of the infrastructure. I'm not suggesting to spend money recklessly, but if these kind of safety issues, safeguards are put in to encourage people, obviously the more people that adapt, they'll bring more with them. They'll understand that for much of their activity, just the one charge from home will be more than adequate, but there are some for whom it won't. Certainly I think what I'm seeing along the motorway network, Tesla have rolled out some technologies on the M8 and on the M7, and I'm sure on others, so that's good, and I'm sure you've been involved in that, and that's very welcome development. But I think it's we can look at it on the major interurban networks, but people always look to the last half mile, closer to home.
And the geographical coverage is important.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
We don't want any place to be left behind.
And we kind of know this ourselves from investment. It doesn't matter what's invested in the national primary routes. Politically, everybody is concerned about, the last half mile on the way home. So it's in the villages, it's in the county towns that people need to be reassured, because that's where the bulk of the activity takes place, and it's the best usage of electric vehicles. Those people who are doing relatively short runs to schools and all of that sort of stuff. So. Well done on what you've done today.
I feel I should at this point. I know the SEAI were here last week to talk to you, and they probably didn't get a chance to talk about the work that they're actually doing in this public awareness space around EVs in the context of all the other things that they were discussing. But there is a very strong public awareness campaign generated within SEAI, which is now being rolled out, particularly across social media. There is an app which will show the availability of EV charging infrastructure and whether or not it's free or available. So there's a lot of work happening in this space, and the SEAI are looking to enhance that constantly. So it's something we absolutely do note. It is incredibly important.
Okay. No, thanks very much for that. I appreciate your input.
Yeah, just to answer Deputy Dooley's questions about Park and Ride in particular. So we do take responsibility for strategic park and ride, certainly the planning of strategic park and ride. And what I mean about that is locations on key rail, light rail and bus corridors. But they're generally proposed to be located around the M50, that kind of area where you do encourage people to interchange onto public transport to get into Dublin City. Similar in our other in the regional cities as well. So we would take responsibility for the design and implementation of those. And in some cases it is about improving where there is existing infrastructure like the Red Cow and on some of the key rail stations as well. In terms of bus purchase, our plan is, at the moment, Dublin Bus are purchasing 9 test vehicles. They're in the process of purchasing those low-emission fleet from 3 manufacturers, and they will be putting them into running testing early next year. And from that will help us then develop our procurement strategy for low-emission double-deck buses, and we will start that procurement next year. There was, as Graham has said, a deliberate, I suppose, decision taken to purchase as much fleet, as much Euro 6 fleet, because that provides other benefits for the city centre, particularly with lower NOx and much lower particulates. We wanted to see those improvements as well, and have as young a fleet as possible operating in our city centres. But now we do have to move forward to address carbon emissions, and Dublin Bus will be starting the trial, which will inform our procurement strategy starting next year. We're also looking at where we can pilot electric bus as well, and we're looking at, in association with Bus Éireann, a small electric pilot in one of the regional towns, which hasn't been identified yet. By 2023, then, we hope to have 500 vehicles transitioned to low-emission fleet, which is about a third of the fleet, the public transport fleet across the state.
Sorry, just in relation to the cost there, we see there was about three times the cost of a low emission, a diesel?
No.
I suppose I was talking about at a particular point in time. I think the issue was very much about let's get more people out of their cars onto buses rather than, but now that differential has come way back down.
Yeah, so the differential will be in the order for a double-deck bus, about 25% to 50% for a low emission. Yeah, more expensive for a low emission hybrid fleet, and double on the electric fleet. But we would expect that as depending on the purchase, and we obviously have to go through procurement, and as those manufacturers are producing more, we'd expect that differential to come down.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Deputy Lahart, if you're ready.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
And thanks for your public service, everybody, and your attendance here today. So I'd like to just ramble around a few things. Some have been mentioned, and there are a number of questions that I have as well. One of the things I noticed, Secretary General, that I thought was missing from your statement were phrases like the Minister is determined, the Minister wants, the Minister is anxious, the Minister is ambitious for. So there's no mention of the Minister. Maybe that is kind of par for the course for contributions. And I suppose the point I'm kind of driving at is the lack of political drive behind some of the things that we're doing or that we need to do. The lack of overall kind of urgency about the situation, and the need, as others have mentioned previously, for the communications piece of this. I often find in relation to, big government proposals, came up in Bus Connects. I made a submission on Bus Connect, so I'm not going to go in on it, and made a pretty detailed submission on it. One of the key questions that came up, and I mentioned it in my submission in public information meetings I held, was who are the NTA? And it's a pretty significant question, and it's one that needs to be addressed, because the public don't know who the NTA is, for example. And we can operate in a bubble when it comes to things like climate change and assume a whole load of things that are happening. And I'm going to refer to a couple of points, whereas the public may often be going off in a different direction. Okay? If you take, for example, EVs, we're all talking about EVs, very little talk about hybrids. The public you've no figures on hybrids here, maybe you have them to give to us, but the public have made a decision that hybrid or a mixture of hybrid is the way they're going until the range anxiety and all of that other kind of stuff is solved. And so we're going to end up with a situation in a few years' time where people are going to have hybrids and a mix and all the rest of it, doing it in good faith, Chair, just as they purchased diesel cars in good faith until the science changed. And now you have all these people ending up with their 171s and 182 diesels, potentially something going to happen in the budget, and now there's this drift, etc., towards it. But the communication piece, I think, is, and it really does need a sustained national communication strategy. It would be one of the things, Chair, that I'd be pushing for here, that this needs to start and it needs to feature continuously in people's lives, that they know that climate change is here and now, but I think there's a real appetite out there for what can I do? And the public's experience of trying to do things by themselves in relation to climate change has been kind of mixed. I remember the first curbside collections which came in Dublin, which was the small green box. It was the size of a milk crate, really wasn't that big. And we discovered after 6 or 7 years of operation of this that, almost all of the material that the public had gone to the trouble of segregating and separating had ended up in landfill. A real case of brushing something under the carpet. It hadn't gone to a recycling plant at all. I think we have serious questions to ask about that now, for example. How much of the material that people recycle actually ends up recycled? How much of it ends up in landfill? How much of the organic material that we put out in Dublin, it's in brown bins, how much of that actually ends up in landfill and how much of it ends up in... Because people do these things in good faith. When the science said something in 2008, people made a shift to diesel because they thought they were doing it in good faith. And yet we continue to publish figures. I mean, the figures published in the pictorial graph there about emissions, I'm making an assumption that that's based on us accepting the figures motor manufacturers are giving us. And yet, they've been lying through their teeth. It's proven that they've been lying through their teeth. And yet, are the figures that we're talking about in terms of reduced emissions? You mentioned a figure that in one of it that 95.6% of vehicles are in A, B emission bands. Now, is that according to the vehicle handbook, or is that actually a scientifically proven fact? Because if it's based on what the manufacturer is telling us, we can't trust that at all. So these are small things, but so the the need for a national communication strategy, and I think the work of this specific committee and the report that we come up with eventually will have to come up with solid, concrete, tangible actions that the public can take in their own home. We've heard some fascinating information. I haven't been at all the meetings, but I have read and watched some back on the player facility in relation to housing and insulation and what other countries are doing around that. And they're the kind of things that we need to look at. So I think the communications piece is the first piece. That this needs to be done, there's an urgency about it, here's what you can do, and here are the range and realms in your personal life that you can do it. The second thing is the political ambition behind it, because you can only do what you're directed to do. And I don't hear that, you know, there's this great big urgency propelling you forward in terms of the work that you do. Just to go through some of the issues that raised, the electric vehicles and the ESB. You know, I don't think we should ultimately leave it exclusively to the ESB. I know maybe in terms of public infrastructure that's important, but I know in the States, I think much maligned Tesla did a deal with was it Burger King or Dunkin' Donuts, so that these charging points are located, you know, in a number of their places. But we need to move towards, I think Dundrum Town Centre has a number of charging points, but we need to move towards a place where people, if they do need to charge, and I take your point about, you know, you'd hope that people would charge at home, but let's look at, I don't know, what is those in terms of the countries that are leading this whole space, what is their experience? Do people predominantly charge at home? If that's the case, well then it's a good place to follow. But I think in terms of hospitals, workplaces, shopping centres, tax offices, where people stop to pause, so that you're not actually just sitting in a car waiting for it to charge, but you can actively do something. And I'll finish on this. You mentioned about transport. It accounts for 20% of our emissions. And then that within that, aviation accounts for 20% of that 20%, and that's going up. And it looks like the way we're heading, that the other transport piece may contract over time if we're lucky, if we achieve all the targets. So we get the electric cars and the buses and the public transport piece, and particularly the infrastructural piece around Bus Connects, which I'm a real supporter of, but I think it should come first. And it relates to what Marcella said about the third runway. It looks like that aviation piece in the Irish context is just going to grow and grow, and there doesn't seem to be any alternative to aviation fuel. So they're just a couple of points. You don't mention aviation specifically, but it looks like it's going to be a growing piece of our issue. Yeah, thanks, Chair.
Who would like to come in first?
Could I maybe just pick up a couple of those points, and maybe Laura would deal again with some of the electric vehicle points. I suppose just in relation to the Minister and he not being mentioned in my statement, I suppose that the committee, I think, made a point of inviting Secretaries General and a series of them over a number of weeks. So I suppose in writing our statement, we were clear that we were invited here as the department. So I suspect that was the reason that we took that approach. I know that the Minister has spoken on this point in committees in the past. I know that he was involved in a significant engagement on climate change last week with the Taoiseach, and it is something that he raises with us regularly as we work through the particularly the public transport piece, which is very much, in our minds, very much about the really important economic impact that providing the right type of public transport and reducing congestion will have, absolutely coupled with, because it obviously, that investment obviously hits both the climate change piece and the economic performance piece, and the Minister is absolutely of a firm mind around that. I think there was I think in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I wrote down all of your questions, but I think there was a good point made in terms of the charging as you go about your business. I think that is an important point, and I know that's something that the electric vehicle or the work on electric vehicles through the task force has absolutely been looking to address. And I want to bring Laura in on that now.
Yeah, just there were a few issues around the EV space. The Deputy, you were asking about the ratio between battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids and so on. In fact, in Ireland, we've had an unusual profile in that regard. Most of our European counterparts have seen more plug-in hybrid vehicles sold than full battery electric vehicles, and in Ireland our ratio was 3 to 1. Now this year, for the first time, that has moved 2 to 1. So, like Deputy Dooley was saying, that there is some slippage to the plug-in hybrid space as opposed to the full battery electric vehicle. But I think in Ireland, the fact that the range is increasing significantly for full battery electric, and the journey distances in Ireland will be conducive to the range that will be available in battery electric vehicles. That's currently available in some, and will certainly be coming on stream over the next year or two, will mean that we will probably have a very strong take-up of full battery electric vehicles here, unlike our European counterparts. You mentioned the emissions testing regimes that have been put in place in order to give vehicles their certification around climate emissions. And so when a vehicle is sold, it's sold with a particular certificate indicating its climate performance based on a test. Now, there were certainly some very well publicised cases around the accuracy or otherwise of those tests. Those particular cases related to manipulation of air quality emissions in the testing as opposed to climate emissions. But it is undoubtedly the case that in a laboratory setting where these types of tests are undertaken, the conditions that are deployed in the tests are not the same as real-world driving emissions. And I think we do assume that there is a certain differential between the certificate base of efficiency or carbon output per kilometre in laboratory testing and real-world testing. We have, across Europe, we've been attempting to deal with that through the introduction of a new testing regime, which is a much longer test cycle over a variety of different modes. So sort of like try to replicate urban driving, long distance driving, over a much longer period. That new series of tests, the outcomes of it will be starting to be seen on vehicle certificates from next year. It'll be introduced from the 1st of January 2019, and then it will be fully implemented by the 1st of January 2020. So all new cars coming on stream over the next couple of years will have their emissions testing outcomes based on a much more rigorous testing model. So we expect to see some differences arising out of that, but we will have a much more accurate representation of the carbon emissions per kilometre. In relation to your points about the private charging points, what we call destination charging, it is undoubtedly the case that there are a large number of them already. There are a large number of businesses, shopping centres, like you said, hotels, supermarkets, making charge points available to their customers in the same way as they make Wi-Fi available and so on. And that's very, very welcome. And we expect that as the number of EVs in the market increases, we expect that to increase. There is an accelerated capital allowance available for businesses who wish to invest in the provision of those. Are they mapped as a matter of interest? They will be mapped shortly as the SEAI take over the mapping of all the electric vehicle charge points. SEAI are taking that over from a government perspective so as to draw together all of the information around where the electric vehicle charge points are, not just the public ESB ones, but they will form part of that mapping from SEAI, and I'm not sure when that's coming on stream, but I can make that available to the committee.
Deputy, I think just the question I missed, sorry, I was drawing a blank before I brought Laura in there, was your aviation question. I suppose in an international context, the trading system is obviously there, and the work on carbon offsetting at ICAO is particularly relevant in that space. This is the emissions from aviation is being looked at that international level, and Ireland's very much taking part in that. So I know that there's a pilot programme from 2021 that we're signed up to, along with the other members of the European Civil Aviation Conference. Also, just within an Irish context, we both under the national aviation policy, but we also have an informal implementation group consisting of ourselves, the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, the EPA and the Irish Aviation Authority, collaborating around the implementation of the pieces that are working through ICAO. And we see technology improving in the aviation space. And there is an ongoing program.
In terms of emissions?
In terms of emissions, okay. There's ongoing programs of fleet replacement in terms of the Irish registered airlines. And then there's other work that's being done very much around air traffic management and operational systems in terms of how much time an aircraft spends lingering on the ground, burning fuel, all of that type of work. So again, there are a variety of measures being looked at in that space, just to answer that question.
Okay. Can I just ask one
very briefly
of the NTA? How confident are you? Because we've had, in budgetary oversight, we had the Road Hauliers Association in, and just because diesel, nothing is matching the torque of diesel. There's nothing has been invented yet to kind of match that. How confident are you? Because I noticed you mentioned the mix again of hybrids and electric hybrid diesel, etc. Because there's no point in going to a fully. And the last time the NTA were here, in a different context, we were kind of saying, look, there isn't an electric engine as yet that could handle the workload of, say, a Dublin bus that's to-ing and fro-ing for 15 or 16 hours a day. How confident are you of getting to the point of, as opposed to a fleet replacement or replenishment for political reasons, as opposed to for genuine climate change reasons that will reap rewards and benefits?
Oh, sorry. I'd be very confident. I mean, I suppose yes, we spoke about it's particularly double-deck fleet. It's whether you can achieve fully electric double-deck fleet and get the range in terms of battery and charging mechanisms. I'd be confident that the battery. I suppose the developments of battery will be such that we would get to have in place fully electric double-deck vehicles at some point. But our move initially is to a hybrid fleet rather than fully electric. In our tests with fully electric fleet, it will be single-deck fleet that we will be looking to test initially with Bus Éireann in smaller towns, and I would imagine, and that fleet is already available.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Senator Grace O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'd just like to say, if anyone's tuning into this, you might think that in order to tackle climate change, you need an EV, because an electric vehicle, because most of the conversation we've had is about electric vehicles. And when you look at the 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, like, how are we really going to tackle it? It's to move into that public transport space, and it's to move away from the individual and the private car. But I have a number of questions to the panel, and thank you very much for your presentation. You haven't mentioned Smarter Travel Policy 2009, and nor did I hear any mention of the National Cycling Policy Framework. And I'm just wondering, is the department being guided by its own policies for smarter travel and National Cycling Policy Framework to achieve emission savings? If you look back, at that 2009 report, I mean, it's fairly shocking, because you see that, you know, where in 2009 we should have been shifting towards public transport, towards sustainable forms of travel. We really haven't been moving in that direction. Congestion is worse than ever. I can tell you, I try to come by train, but I travel from Tramore to Dublin to Leinster House. A journey that should take 2 hours takes me 4 hours because of congestion and road traffic. And I can tell you it's nothing if not highly frustrating. With regard to the cycling, are there any policies in place to encourage electric bicycles? I lived in the Netherlands for years, where you saw incredibly efficient transport networks for cyclists. Is there any move towards facilitating cyclists? Because at the moment, if you look here in Dublin, you know, I mean, the buses driving on the cycle lanes, the cyclist is in a very precarious situation. I see no change in the support of cycling.
Sorry for disturbing you, Senator. Could all phones be switched on to flight mode, please? Thank you. Just interferes with the broadcasting. Sorry.
You know, I'd like to put it to the department. Like, what are you doing to support cyclists? What are you doing to support the walkers? You know,
it's on flight mode, is it?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, what is being done? Because these are the real areas where we'll get the serious, you know, a zero greenhouse gas emission. So if we really are here to tackle climate change, you know, what's happening in those areas? I have a number of questions here. You talked, Mr. Doyle, about the alternative fuels offer, one of the most cost-effective pathways to reducing emissions. What is the cost per tonne of CO2 emissions abated by using alternative fuels? As more EVs are deployed, how will the shortfall in revenue be made up? So the Department of Finance say they're studying this, but what is under consideration between your department, Transport, and the Department of Finance? And what increase in emissions does the NTA foresee in the Greater Dublin area to 2035? Will you revive the GDA transport strategy in line with national targets for CO2 reduction? Another one, did both your department and the NTA refused to approve hybrid buses for Dublin in 2014? Why would you have done this, you know? And what are you doing now to speed up? I suppose my own frustration is that, with all due respect, Mr. Doyle, I hear your submission, but I don't really think we are taking the urgency that we see in the recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly and applying that to the policy and to what we truly need to mitigate and adapt in terms of climate change. I have one more question, Chair, if I may. There's concern about sea level rise on transport infrastructure. The train, the Waterford-Rosslare train, is constantly under threat of flooding when there's heavy rains and that. So what is your department do to address issues like rail and adaptation measures?
Thank you, Senator. So there's a number of questions there. Whoever would like to come in first?
There's quite a few questions there. Well, Senator, the Senator I know is a fellow Waterford person, so I'm very familiar with the road that she talks about, I'm afraid, and the journey from Tramore and all of that. I see Deputy Butler here earlier as well. I think you're absolutely right in terms of your first point. If somebody ditches their car and gets onto public transport, their diesel or petrol car and gets onto public transport, it's the same effect from a climate change perspective, or onto a bike indeed, as switching to EVs. I suppose we've had a lot of questions about EVs, and obviously with over 50% of emissions coming from the private car in the country, and knowing that we've got a very dispersed population within the country who, in many cases, are going to be reliant on their car, where the settlement patterns make it difficult to provide public transport alternatives. I suppose that it's natural. I think that a lot of the discussion tends towards EVs, but I spoke about the levels of investment and the really significant increases in public transport investment over the coming years that we've worked very, very hard towards trying to argue for, and now have to go and deliver now that the funding is available, is a critical point. So thank you for that. In terms of smarter travel, I suppose, 2009 and the period of investment after that, and the lost period of investment after that, is probably the most significant point around all of that. We are now back into a space, though, where we are actually investing, and investing heavily again. And I think following last year's budget, I think we were able to announce a doubling of our investment, more than a doubling of our investment in the public transport space over a short number of years. And we were able to invest in cycling. There have been, we've had the specific questions about how much is invested specifically in cycling and all of that. Quite often it's very difficult, because obviously there are various types of vehicles on the road, and there are various programs. A quality bus corridor can benefit cyclists. Some of the investment around Lewis would have also. But now we're able to say that over the coming I think it's this year, and over the coming 3 years, we've set specifically aside, I think it's 106 million or 110 million specifically for investment in city-based cycling. We have specified over the same period, I think it's in the order of 50 to 55 million, somewhere in that space, in the greenway space, and Bus Connects, which Anne touched on earlier in response to a question. Again, very difficult to say out of a over €2 billion programme specifically how much of this is for the cycle lane element, but we can see that that under that programme over 200 kilometres of improvements to existing cycling lanes and routes, or indeed new ones, will be delivered. So that's really where the real game is at in terms of cycling for commuting, and we have seen really significant improvements, particularly in Dublin, I think, in terms of.
Cyclists would say that.
No, not improve. Sorry, Deputy. If you just let me finish the sentence. It was. The improvements in terms of the infrastructure is what I was talking about for the moment, but in terms of the numbers, probably shouldn't have used the term improvements, but in terms of the numbers, we've seen really, really significant increases. I might just, you asked about electric bicycles and incentives for that. There is the Bike to Work scheme, which I think allows an individual €1,000 of tax relief. My understanding is that electric bikes come under that. I'm pretty sure I'm correct in that. And I might just. You mentioned 2014 and a proposal for hybrid buses. I'm not aware of that, but I can check it. I suspect the differentials at the time in terms of the price, and again back to my point about Is it a question of getting 1 or 2 or 3 busloads of people out of their cars, or 1 busload, I suppose, would have been the issue at the time, but we can certainly check whether there was a proposal back then. I might just ask Laura just to deal with the alternative fuels question, and also the adaptation question that you asked. And you specifically asked about rail, and I know that I know that I mentioned in my opening statement the work that Irish Rail have been doing in that space. So I might just ask Laura to answer on those.
Refresh my memory on the alternative fuels question.
The question, Senator O'Sullivan.
It was, you said alternative fuels offer one of the most cost-effective pathways in the submission to reducing emissions.
Oh yeah, certainly.
What is the cost per tonne of CO2 emission?
Undoubtedly, in terms of the investment in public transport is significant, and it is costly. We're very willing to undertake it for climate reasons and for a variety of other reasons. However, it is internationally acknowledged that as we progress and transition to the use of alternative fuels, that provides the most cost-effective pathway for the transport sector to decarbonise between now and 2050. As the technologies become mass-produced, as they become more widely available, the cost of them comes down, and it is essentially then just a replacement cost of existing vehicles, which happens anyway. So it is the most. Currently in the National Mitigation Plan, it is true that the incentivisation of EVs comes in as the most expensive on the marginal abatement cost curve. That's because of the price differential that currently exists between EVs and the significant cost of incentives in order to try to bridge that customer acceptance and cost barrier at the moment, while the cost differential is significant. But we do expect that over time that cost differential will fall, and that it is likely that the alternative fuel technologies may even become cheaper to manufacture than the existing vehicles. So that's an important piece. On adaptation, and we certainly, the government published this year its national adaptation framework, within which all of us as departments and sectors are working to produce our own sectoral adaptation plans. So the Department of Transport is tasked with writing the transport sectoral framework, and we are working with the other key infrastructure departments in order to identify with our various stakeholders and agencies what the critical infrastructure is, mapping that critical infrastructure, mapping the impacts of the climate on those critical infrastructure pieces, and making an estimate of what we call the adaptation cost, which is the cost that will be necessary in order to invest, in order to ensure that we can continue and maintain transport infrastructure and services as we see various different climate impacts impacting upon that. So that work is well underway. In the specific case of the rail line that you mentioned, Irish Rail are well advanced in their mapping of their infrastructure vulnerabilities and the assessments of the various different programmes that will be necessary in order to shore up is a word I hate to use in that context, but in order to maintain the infrastructure and services, and so that will all be fed into our transport adaptation plan as it's written.
Just that final question: as the EVs are being deployed, how will the shortfall in revenue be made up? Are you meeting with the Department of Finance and yourselves? You know,
there's a working group on motor tax policy that will be looking at that very issue over a period of time.
That's great. Thank you, Senator. Did you want to come in?
Just in response to the Smarter Travel policy 2009, so obviously that was the focus in our greater Dublin area transport strategy up to 2035. So we would have taken the targets that were set out in that as part of that strategy. I'm not sure. I think we have modelled what the what the emission levels related to that transport strategy is. I don't have them available, but I'll certainly make that available for the committee. And we will be reviewing our transport strategy. We are required to do it statutorily on a 6-year basis, and obviously we will examine it in terms of emissions at that time. In terms of the, I think that was it from my perspective.
You may not have this information now, and maybe you could provide this to us in writing.
Yes, certainly.
Be able to also provide us with a breakdown just in relation to the age of the bus fleet in our main cities, Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, Waterford. Just how many are under 5 years old, how many are 10 years old, and just the age profile of the fleet across the country. And what could you tell us today? When is a bus normally decommissioned? At how many years old?
Usually between 12 and 14 years. It depends. The city fleet would usually be older, and then those that use Bus Éireann would have to be decommissioned at an earlier stage because it obviously operates more mileage. But we try and keep an average age of about 7 years, 6 to 7 years of fleet.
That'd be great if we could get the breakdown. And just in relation to increased capacity for trains, trams and the Dart and Lewis lines, are there any plans there in relation to increasing the capacity of those?
Yeah, on the heavy rail, so we're at full capacity. All fleet carriages are currently being used by Irish Rail to deliver services. So we currently have no additional capacity available, or Irish Rail have no additional capacity available. So the next, I suppose, what we need to do is actually purchase fleet. So there is a 3 to 4 year lead-in time in terms of purchasing fleet, and we hope to commence that procurement this year. But that's the lead-in time in terms of delivery. We're looking at other delivery options in the meantime because we do have capacity issues on our commuter rail, to see is there leasing options or other options where we can bring fleet in at a much earlier stage. In terms of the Lewis lines, we have there was delivery earlier this year of longer trams, which facilitated the extension of the Green Line. There are more trams also being delivered in about 2 years' time to assist with the capacity on the Green Line.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Just to say around the... sorry.
Just on that, there's a capacity issue on the trains at peak hour as well. So just, I mean, that's something that needs to be taken into account in terms of timetabling planning. But also, would you inform us about congestion, what you're doing to, in terms of timetabling around congestion? Because I hear from people the whole time that the bus rides into Limerick and the bus to Waterford had already gone 10 minutes because of the congestion impacts it's having on efficient liaising with other buses or whatever, you know.
Well, congestion is having an impact on all our cities in terms of not just the movement for car journeys, but also for public transport as well. And so that's why we're developing the Bus Connects programmes in our regional cities, commencing with Dublin, which is about trying to get much higher level of bus priority available for our bus system to enable journey times to be regular, so that people know how long the journey is going to be, and to give that kind of level of priority to avoid the types of issues that you're raising where one bus may not meet another because of delays. So we're continually looking through the automatic vehicle allocation systems that are on bus to see where delays are occurring with the operators, putting in, building and changing timetables so that we can ensure that those buses that need to interchange are interchangeable. But if there's a particular issue at any particular place in Limerick, you just let me know and we'll follow that up in particular.
Did you want to come in, Mr. Doyle?
Yeah. It's only a very quick point as we talked about rail capacity. I know that a lot of the investment that we're now looking at around electrification, in particular in signalling work, is very much about trying to put more train paths through, particularly on the commuter type services, and that really does have a very significant impact on just the overall capacity in the system in terms of what we can deliver, and that's very much part of the projects that Anne is working on.
Thank you. Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairperson. I suppose quite a few of my questions have been answered already through the talks, but I would just like to Well, that's just, in relation to you talked about the interdepartmental meetings that take place at a high level between yourself and other people, other departments. I'm just wondering, is the minutes of those available? Where are they available? And, can we get a look and see what's actually discussed at these meetings? If you just outline that in relation to it. The other thing I wanted to ask was in relation to, I suppose, particularly in relation to, I'll give an example of in Galway, there's a new road being planned at the moment, and it's costing some astronomical figures of it. I think about 80 or 90 million for 2 kilometres or something like that. There, belting through, actually, right through the sensitive environmental area. But yet there's been no look at how the trains can work in Galway, or how a rail network would work and offset the building of the road. So I'm just wondering how that all fits in terms of what you're actually doing in terms of climate change and how transport is supposed to work. And also, I suppose, all the discussion today has been around Dublin, and that's grand, but I'm from Donegal, and there's been no mention at all of anything outside of Dublin and the greater urban areas. And I suppose, okay, that's fair enough, because the biggest change is going to happen in Dublin. But I think somewhere in the region of about half the population lives outside of the urban areas. So I'm just wondering what efforts, has been done in relation to people who live outside the urban areas, in terms of how they can adapt and how they can change. If I was to come here by train, I probably wouldn't be able to do it in one day. If I was to come by bus, it would take forever. So how are we going to adapt and change, and how are you doing it? And in light of that, I suppose, what have you made? What efforts have the department made to look at there was a pilot rural transport scheme financed by Leader over the last number of years by the Leader programme. What have you done in relation to that? What have you learned from that, and what are you actually going to roll out in terms of rural communities as well and rural population?
Thank you. So the rural element is important there, and there were other members who are not here today who would raise the issue about rural Ireland and access to even the capital.
Okay, I'll just take a quick run through those, and maybe Anne would come in on elements of that as well. Just in terms of the various meetings that take place, I suspect it's possible that there's no difficulty getting minutes in relation to some of them. I'm not sure in relation to meetings like senior officials group and whatever, but we can look into what's available.
They're not available now. The minutes aren't available anywhere now.
Right. I think the EV task force meetings are available, aren't they? Minutes of those.
Yeah, I think our LEV task force minutes are available on our website. But we're about to publish the report of phase 1, which has a summary of all of the meetings anyway. So that we could certainly make that available.
The reason I'm
well, it's to be considered by government. So, so as soon as we can get it approved by government, we'll release the report of phase 1.
The reason I'm asking just is because at the last week's meeting, the Department of Climate Change told us all these reports were available to her, all these meetings took place too. And so basically, there's no real need for us as such.
Well, I certainly. And I'm not here saying that today.
But none of this information is available widely to the public, because they're not available. You just don't make them available. So I just wanted to ask whether they're.
No, absolutely. I think that I'll just in terms of the. I suppose we've had a lot of chat here today about EVs, as Senator O'Sullivan pointed out, and we've had a lot of talk about public transport, particularly in, well, not just Dublin in fairness, but I think in the cities generally. I know that we've done a lot of work, and Anne's organisation has done a huge amount of work around rural transport links, local links, which you mentioned Donegal. I know it's very active in the Donegal space. Just one stat that's not an official stat. It's something that we did a bit of work on a number of years ago. Was, traditionally as a department, we were spending about 80% of our overall budget outside the Greater Dublin area. a lot of investment in roads over the years, a lot of investment in rail, and that sometimes surprises people. That will come down in reality over the next number of years as we look to invest in some of the large-scale transport projects that are city-based. With Bus Connects is well over 2 billion. That's very much around Dublin and around regional cities, in fairness, and obviously around things like Metro. So that sort of number will come down.
You could probably say, Mr. Doyle, that therefore 20% of your investment generates about 90% of the conversation.
Could say that. I pointed out from Waterford earlier, and I live there still, so I have some sympathy for the question. Could I just ask Anne just to deal with the elements that are relevant?
So just to you mentioned Galway in particular and the bypass, and I suppose one of the things that I think in the approach to the bypass that was probably different in this case was that, you know, we looked at us, the NTA, with TII about what can be done in terms of an integrated transport plan for Galway City itself, and that plan has been developed in advance actually of the plans or in association with the plans for the bypass, and that plan has been adopted by Galway City and County Council. So to the extent that there's now money identified for Bus Connects Galway of a 200 million investment proposed to actually tackle congestion by improving public transport within both public transport but sustainable transport in Galway City, and really the next stage is really about implementation of the strategic plan, transport plan for Galway. In terms of Donegal, I'm sure some of the bus operators that operate like McGinley's would be very disappointed to hear that the bus takes forever from Donegal, because obviously it's regularly used, very popular service, and other services that are provided in terms of getting from Donegal. And the Local Link scheme in Donegal, Local Link Donegal, provides quite a significant amount of services right across the Donegal county, and we continue to support and try to develop even more links between towns, villages and rural areas to ensure that people have a choice. Where they may not have a car, they have a choice to get to their local town by using public transport, and we would continue to develop that for rural Ireland.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Senator Máire Devine.
Thank you, and thanks for your presentation. Sorry it's been in and out, but just to reiterate the comment about the charging network for electrical vehicles, it needs visibility. I concur with other speakers. John Lahart in particular is just almost they've become normalised and as frequent as bus stops, so they're part of every, you know, street, town or village, given the security to people, and the psychology of viewing that actually starts to grow in the mind, and you feel the reliability will be there, and you won't be left abandoned in the middle of the night somewhere in the darkest of the country. As the transport emissions are still going up year on year on year, even though we're trying to, I suppose, get this inclusion of you know, electrical vehicles, but we don't seem to be getting there, and part of it perhaps is the fibs that were told to us by the car companies and diesel and their supposed clean emissions, but it's concerning that it keeps going up. The 500 buses that are due, I'm obviously Dublin centric, so I apologise, Deputy Pringle and the rest of you, but obviously the 500 buses will be converted to low emissions. What fuel will they use? What specific fuel will be done? And I presume it's in the main it will be Dublin Bus, which ties into the Dublin or the Bus Connects and the proposals put before the people of Dublin for the revamp of their bus services. It seems now we're going to push it out to 220, 221 perhaps, because of the overwhelming amount of submissions, over 20,000 submissions from Dublin people, which is really promising as well. I mean, it could be viewed negatively and it's an awful workload, but it's also very promising. I know a number of those submissions would have asked the question about sustainable buses and sustainable transport within the city. The procurement, so how does that tie in? I think it would be a missed opportunity, and I said it before at when you had the public consultation for Bus Connects, it would be a missed opportunity, I think, to not introduce our electric vehicles and buses at the same time as the Bus Connects, whatever shape that takes, is rolled out. Not just giving certainty to the bus time and the bus travel within Dublin, but kind of a real positive curve on our future city, and trying to get around it, but also keeping it as moderately clean as we can. If we could get movement on the electrical vehicles. Today now, Minister Naughton attended the environmental conference, and he was talking about, like, in 2011 we had 127 landfills, and it mightn't be a particular question for here, but and now we're down to 2 major ones throughout the city. We did talk about excess waste going into the black bin, and that being going into landfill. Landfill's going to go very quickly. I'm not sure if it's your area of technicality, but if you're going to rely on biofuels, I was at actually a recycling plant and watching but again, I'm not convinced that they're recycling every single thing that we're carefully putting in our bins. But is there any possibility of using biofuels, or is it possible to convert the landfills into biofuel manufacture? And could you buy it off them? Maybe it's for a different as opposed to yourselves. I think that's in the main. All right, just one thing as well for the NTA, the park and ride facilities. I know the Red Cow is chock-a-block day in, day out, and yet when we were building the National Children's Hospital, going through Bord Penala, no cars, downgrading of car park spaces within the campus, St James's campus itself, and told to use the Red Cow. Now, for staff and patients and children in particular to use that, or any indeed of the campus in St James's, they were told to park at the Red Cow and use the Lewis to get in and access the campus and the hospital. It's over capacity. You just can't get into it, so most people then just don't bother and park around the general streets of the hospital itself, causing further chaos with residential areas. Are there plans to increase capacity? How do you go about that? Obviously you've got to buy a lot of land to build statutory car parks, but if you could make a comment on that. Gurmalgus.
Thanks, Senator. Just, I mean, your first point on visibility and communications is a point that has come up loud and clear today, yeah. And it's something that I know Laura will take back to the task force around that. So the point is well made again. Yes, all of the efforts and all of the work that is going in, whether it's in modal shift, whether it's around the uptake of technology, whether it's biofuels and all of that, it's yes, it's still the case that emissions from transport are rising, and this is something that emissions in transport is probably the one that's been the most difficult internationally to try and deal with. In our own case here in Ireland, I mean, it is the case that every transport trip is less emitting than it was in the past, and emissions themselves are not growing at the rate of the demand for transport as the economy does well for all of the and all of the types of trips that we talked about earlier on. I think that what we've got to try and do is that demand for transport that is going to continue as our population grows, and hopefully the economy can still continue. You know, the growth piece we have to manage by, to the greatest extent possible, by these very heavy investments that we're making in public transport. The technology change piece is tremendously important then for our existing scenario, and I know it doesn't split into two parts like that, but that's one way that we sometimes think about it in the first instance. So absolutely that is the challenge for us that you've outlined there. Just in terms of your questions on, there was a question on alternative fuels, which I think Laura would be happy to answer, and I know there were 2 questions for Anne there around bus connects and again around park and ride.
So there was a question about the fleet as well. What type of fleet would be included in terms of low emission? So it's likely to be a mixture of diesel hybrid or CNG fleet that we're about to test with both Bus Éireann and Dublin Bus to see what are the emissions associated with that type of fleet, which then will inform our procurement strategy, which will start at the end of this year, and we hope to see delivery starting late next year in terms of the low emission fleet. We also want to test a fully electric fleet, but we want to do it in a small basis in a town rather than Dublin, to see what the infrastructure costs are and test all that out before we can look to multiply it up into a Dublin system. But also it's to see whether the type of fleet because we use unusually for other cities, certainly in Europe, don't use a double-deck fleet the way we do in Ireland and in the UK, and it's really the development of whether we can get a good battery-powered system for double-deck fleet, and that's what we want to kind of work and engage with manufacturers to see can that be delivered at a reasonable price for the city, along with the infrastructure. In terms of park and ride, yes, we know we've got to significantly improve the park and ride facilities right around the city region. And I suppose it's one of the measures, car parking and constraining car parking within city centres, but also within facilities. It is a means, or part of a means, to try and encourage people to use public transport. You do have to balance it, and make sure that you have the public transport and the park and ride facilities available to allow people to make that change. But yes, I wasn't aware actually that there was capacity issues at the Red Cow, but certainly I'll take that away now and have a look at that.
No, massive.
Okay.
Laura, do you want to come in?
Maybe briefly, in the context of the move to alternative fuels within the bus space, the department is working with the NTA, and we expect to begin a significant trial of alternative bus technologies beginning this November on routes in Dublin and in Cork. So what we hope to do is to trial retrofitted buses, fully electric, hybrid electric, compressed natural gas buses along specific routes with similar driving patterns and so on, and measure the tailpipe emissions. So get a real understanding of both the carbon emissions and the air quality emissions that arise in the context of all of the various different technologies. We've been looking at the international literature around all of this, and we've been finding it conflicting in parts, and I think it's probably fair to say we need to have a much better understanding of how the various technologies would work in an Irish context, in Irish cities along real bus routes that are in the way that they're operated within Ireland. So that trial will be beginning in November, and we hope to see outcomes and results from that by the end of Q1 next year. And we hope that initially it will have to be a hybrid strategy for the urban buses in the short run, but we hope that the results of that trial and our research in that will feed into the NTA in terms of the longer term procurement strategy around as the technologies are improving, and as decisions about the necessary investment in infrastructure to support, if we transition a bus fleet in Dublin or Cork or any of the cities to compressed natural gas, for example, or to electricity, to full electricity, there's a significant infrastructure piece that's required to go along with that. So we need to get a fuller understanding of how that will work in a real sense before we take longer-term decisions. You did have one question about waste to biofuel. Currently, a lot of the biofuel that's currently in petrol and diesel in Ireland comes from used cooking oil. So there's a lot of waste already being deployed in the transport sector in biofuels, and the anaerobic digester that is currently in existence, which is producing biogas, is using waste to produce biogas, and there will be significant potential for that. As the market for compressed natural gas increases, and then we can substitute in biogas for it in order to make it even less carbon emitting over time.
Thank you. Deputy Ryan, I'm going to bring you next. Or Senator Marshall, do you want to go? Thank you.
I think all the questions have been covered adequately by most of my colleagues. There's just one question I'd like to, a point I'd like you to address. You continue to make reference to testing, and when you look at this renewables, this section of business, it's moving that fast. It's a continually changing landscape. Is there a school of thought or an argument to say that actually you take the information that you have both locally, nationally, internationally, and you make a decision on something, because it's changing so fast? I don't think that Dublin or Cork or Ireland per se is that unique and that different to many other cities or places around Europe, that there is an argument to say that it could be a costly process and actually just slow up the rate of progress in moving towards renewable public transport.
I think we're going to make a massive investment in terms of alternative fuel buses. 500 vehicles over the next number of years. It's a massive investment. I think that we need to learn what we can from where some of these technologies operate elsewhere. And of course, you're absolutely right, the technology has been changing and improving. We are very much aware, though, of the fact that there are different conditions operating, depending on how bus fleet operates or how it's deployed in different cities, does have an impact. So it's just, we have committed to not buying any more diesel-only urban buses from mid-2019. There's a date on that, so that is an action point, and I think, look, from a whole variety of perspectives, and particularly from a climate change perspective, but there's value for money and lots of other things in there as well. I think that the testing is absolutely the right thing to do. The start date on that,
The start date for the commitment is the 1st of July next
year.
No,
the start date in terms of the trials is
November.
It's very, very soon.
It's very imminent.
So this is something that we're doing now.
Completed when then?
We're talking about a 14-week period for the trial, because we have like 12 to 14 buses to run through the trial. So in order to ensure that each.
Yeah, this is something we're going to.
And I think it's probably useful to point out that in terms of our international research around the deployment of alternative fuels and technologies in bus fleets, one of the key lessons that has emerged is that actually it is a local solution to a local problem. In fact, a key decision is looking at the network that you have and the types of bus systems that you have in order to determine from that what the best technology to deploy in that context is, and it's very much horses for courses in the various different cities that have deployed different technologies. So we just want to be sure that we get the right solutions for ours.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was keen to come back in because I know Deputy Stanley was very upset at my own, or seemed to be, my intervention at the start. But I did ask that in the debate because I think it's really important to work out, do a very short time frame, what are we doing and what questions do we really need to ask? And I was, as I said, I just want, by point of information, this access to information and opening up the process of drafting the new National Energy and Climate Action Plan is one of the most useful facilities we have. And so in that regard, the failure to get any of the reports we'd asked the Minister, or indeed hear the Secretary-General say today that he didn't even know that we'd put in the request that in advance of this meeting we would get a list of the new things you're thinking of doing to put into the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, because that's the interesting stuff. And I don't know how that didn't get to you, but I think we would have been far better off if we had those measures to discuss, because you've got to do this by Christmas, I understand. I'll start by asking questions. What do you think our transport emissions will be in 2030?
Can I just respond to the first question first, around the NECP? Member states under the EU energy package are required to prepare and submit integrated plans, as you know, and that work, it's naturally being led by our sister department, Communications, Climate Action and Environment, as they map the various strands, I suppose, that go into that. They tell us that they are very shortly going to go to public consultation around that, and obviously the transport sector will be a key component part of it. I think the measures in the National Mitigation Plan will be built upon, and the investment in measures committed to under the National Development Plan will certainly are certainly a core part of that. And I suppose with the outcomes of the consultation process, that will form the basis for our input into the NECP. Our understanding is that while December is a date, that this is going to be an iterative process. So that's where we are in terms of in terms of the question you posed. If we've missed something that you were looking for before today, we certainly apologise, but I wasn't aware of in terms of where you were coming from earlier on. Laura, you might just address the 2030 question. It's a tough question, so I'll leave it to you.
I think it's fair to say that where I couldn't possibly tell you, we're currently at about 12.2 megatons in terms of transport emissions in Ireland, all of which are in the non-ETS. We have a national target to meet by 2030, which is a 30% reduction on 2005 levels of all of our non-ETS emissions, and every sector will be required to play its part in achieving that 30% reduction. I think we have always sort of felt that, and it has always been acknowledged, that there needs to be a least cost approach to reducing emissions, non-ETS emissions, and measures should be deployed in the order and timeframes at which they're most cost effective in order to achieve the transition that we need to do.
Can I go back to yourself as the Secretary-General? You're right, it's an iterative process. Mr Doyle, it starts in about 12 weeks' time. Let's say I'm the European Commission and they're coming here before Christmas. They're going to ask this question: what are your projection of climate change emissions from transport by 2030? What do you say to them?
Look, we have to. I'm sorry.
They will be lower than they are now.
The issue for us has to be to try and get them as low as we possibly can with the various tools at our disposal.
Have you done any modelling forecasting of what the transport emissions are going to be in 2030?
We participate in the TRAM group, and the TRAM group has commissioned that modelling to take place. So that modelling is being requested by the TRAM group of the research agencies that participate in it.
Which research agencies?
We haven't done it ourselves, but we certainly have commissioned.
Who would I go to get an answer to the question what the projected transport emissions are in 2030?
Well, in terms of that work, that is work that's being carried out to give us that.
By who?
To give us that.
Is it the research?
Who's projecting our transport emissions by 2030?
Well, it's not transport emissions on their own. The modelling is being carried out for the entire system, for the entire emission system. So it isn't like, it's not a question of us going off to commission transport emissions modelling or the Department of Communications Climate Action going off to commission the energy sector's emissions. Likely, it is being considered as an energy system as a whole, and that modelling is. My understanding is that DCCA have commissioned UCC.
Ms. Bean, you said it's going to be low. Yeah, they do. You said transport emissions is going to be lower. Why do you think that?
Because I think all the various different measures that we're currently deploying in terms of the biofuels obligation scheme increases, the transition to lower emitting technologies, the improvements in vehicle efficiencies that are mandated.
Our emissions grew 4% last year. I can ask a different question. The trans people presented to us, they said they estimate that to 2030 we have a 50 million tonne shortfall, and this is something in the iterative process that we have to show, and we have to start in 12 weeks' time, how we're going to close that gap. How much of that 50 million tonne shortfall do you think transport would be responsible for in this iterative process, in this new National Energy Climate Action Plan? How much of the 50 million are you going to help us reduce?
We've got a national target that we've all got to work towards. We've talked about how that's being coordinated across government. There are, in the transport space, we're very focused in this area. We've worked extremely hard to argue very strongly for heavy investment in public transport. That's been a huge focus of our work as a department and my personal work over recent years. We now have a plan that Senator O'Sullivan made the very important point. It's not just about EVs. And even when people are in EVs, by the way, there could be a congestion issue if we're not moving people onto public transport. We focused on that piece. We have so the modal shift piece we focused on. We're technology takers when it comes to electric vehicles in terms of private car use or other versions. We're pressing extremely hard as technology takers, albeit, to see standards improve, particularly in the freight space, because if
you don't mind, Mr. Doyle, what I don't need in this instance is a reiteration of all the different measures. We've just heard 3 hours of that. I want to focus specifically on the issue of how we draft this new National Energy and Climate Action Plan. And the reason we called in Secretary Generals here, because we're going to be asking the same question to Agriculture and all the other Secretary Generals, is we know there's a 50 million tonne shortfall at least on the modelling projections. And to try and get some sense, what's the plan to address that? And to do that, if transport is saying, or maybe this hasn't been done yet, have you not sat down with the different departments and said, we know we have this 50 million tonne shortfall, how are we going to address it?
Deputy, those things are being looked at in the context of what's cost effective, what can be done. We know from a transport perspective, in terms of how other countries have dealt and have made progress, they are primarily in the areas that we've talked about. We're trying to focus every effort on trying to deliver those in the first instance. And yes, we do need to look at how much further can we go. But in the first instance, we've got to be very, very focused on the work that has been laid out. And yes, we've talked about for the last 3 hours or whatever it is, stuff that, no doubt, given your huge interest in this area, that you've heard before, and I respect that. But from our perspective, we are making progress on implementing those key measures. There's been a huge amount of work that's been done around electric vehicles and alternatively fueled vehicles. There's been good work done around alternative fuels, biofuels, obligation scheme, etc., that's having an impact across those key areas. We have focused really heavily on trying to get serious investment into the public transport space. I've heard you talk in the past about the balance between roads, spending on roads and spending on public transport. We're shifting that balance at this point. in the first instance, all of those really key things where we're looking at a country that has a dispersed population, where we're technology takers, where we've got to go and focus on the areas, and we have been doing that.
Can I just say, when we respond to the European Union that we are technology takers, I just don't think that's good. They're going to take that as an answer. Can I ask another question? What are the key public transport projects that are being built today, in construction today, now?
There is, look, we had a period of time where investment in this country was very heavily constrained, as we all know. We tried to keep up a pipeline in terms of doing a lot of the analysis, such that when finance became available, that those projects could happen. It's clear that obviously a huge project like Metro, for example, which has huge benefits.
If I can just question. The question asked was, what are the key public transport being built now?
The key
today.
We're in a phase now of gearing up to start delivering the projects that are laid out.
Is none the answer?
Just let Mr. Doyle finish, and I'll let you in. I will let you in, Deputy.
My train of thought.
Yeah, we'll give you.
If you let me finish, Deputy, in fairness.
If you could answer the question.
I am answering the question.
Yeah.
We have a situation where we look at projects like Metro, for example. The day you put a shovel in the ground to the day you cut a ribbon on it, you don't see the benefit of those. What we do have rolling out currently is significant investment in the bus network in particular, and Bus Connects is a projectised version of that. But we are making very, very significant investments now. Senator O'Sullivan talked about our investments in cycling. The significant increase in investment in cycling is happening over the coming 3 years. This isn't something that we've put at some point in the future. So investments are happening. The work has been continued.
But the answer is there is no big public transport project on the ground now. There are, unless maybe Ms. Graham knows.
Yeah, I'm going to let Ms. Graham. She's indicated to come in on this particular issue.
While there isn't a major infrastructure project on the ground at the moment, what we are doing is improving on the services side. So tomorrow we'll be announcing an increase that effectively introduced 10% additional capacity in Dublin's bus services over the next 3 months. So that's a very significant increase in the amount of service that's available in the Dublin region. So what we're able to do while we're building up the infrastructure projects is change networks, improve services, add in additional services, and like 10% increase in 3-month period is very significant in terms of the Dublin region.
The reason I asked the question, and Ms. Graham knows this, because I have been deeply frustrated here, as someone who's fascinated about supporting public transport in Dublin, the fact that every single approach road to Dublin has been widened. You've got projects like the N7 upgrades going ahead now. There's projects to upgrade the N11, the N2, the N3, the N4. There are 10 motorways and national roads at construction now, and there's not a single public transport project. And you tell me emissions are going to fall. How many cars do you think will be on the road in 2030?
I'm going to let Ms. Graham. She's indicated to come in just on this issue.
Well, we also have to accept that we delivered an extension to the Green Line, also like investing over 360 million in a major piece of public transport infrastructure that has seen very significant growth in public transport use as well. So even at a time when Ireland had difficulty in terms of investment, the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport invested in that project, which has now been delivered. So like we also then have to invest continually in the infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, to keep it maintained, and over 200 million is invested every year in that. We have to keep our bus fleet at an age profile and try and invest in it. And again, there's tens of millions every year that goes into the investment in fleet. We know that we have to radically improve our public infrastructure even more, and the plans are there. The investment profile is there now, and now we need to work on making that infrastructure and putting that infrastructure in place.
I cheer every one of them on. What's the projection of the number of cars on the road in 2030? It's growing 50,000, 55,000 a year. there's no reason to expect that would change. Is there? Economic growth's not going to fall.
The economic growth goes through cycles, as you know.
But
well, and there's also the phenomenon of peak car, and transport, like demand for passenger cars or whatever, is a function of a number of different variables.
It's likely that over the 12, 13-year period we're looking at an additional 500,000 cars.
And if that's from the current fleet of 2.2 million.
Yeah.
I suppose,
I'll accept your word on that.
And this is why we are going to have to make sure that we do all we can to try and make sure that any additional cars coming on the road, or the greatest percentage of them that we can achieve, are alternatively fuelled.
Just briefly, two other questions.
Deputy, just to say that again on the point of investing in roads. I mean, ultimately, policy around this is a matter for government. I personally argued and successfully in prior to becoming Secretary General, I was in charge of public transport for a period. And just the rebalancing of our investment towards public transport, such that over the next 5 years we're looking at, I think the investment in roads is in the order of 1.5 to 1.6 billion. The investment in public transport over the next 5 years is 2.7 billion. So we've changed a ratio where it was probably that level of investment was probably. This isn't a scientific figure, but it was probably 2 to 1 adverse. It's now moved in the sort of 1.5 to 1 space in the other direction. So this is stuff that we are trying to bring about today.
Can I just say that there's 11.1 billion planned for roads and 8 point something built on public transport. And the truth is, today it's 10 roads, no public transport. There are 55 other national motorways and national roads planned. There's only 3 big public transport projects that I see. But I want to move to cycling if I can. Other than the Royal Canal, which I love the developments happening there, can you name me another major cycling investment happening at the moment?
Well, I can't name project by project, but there is the Royal Canal, that we are obviously bringing forward. And I suppose what we have to recognise is that in the downturn, in terms of when there wasn't capital investment available, we did put in place a strategic cycling plan for the Dublin region and also for our other regional cities, so that when we're in the phase and when we now have investment available, we're able to provide a network of cycle facilities rather than individual facilities that haven't been connected up. The Bus Connects programme that we will be going forward in terms of the bus corridors will see a really significant increase in the number of dedicated, segregated cycle facilities along all our key radial corridors, and that is really very significant investment for the Dublin region.
Which is what I hope this committee would do, is build the political support for that. Because believe me, I don't think it exists at the moment. And the scale of the change we need is so great that the political support you need is so great, and we're nowhere near it. Like nowhere. And the numbers of cyclists went up last year. Yeah, but they went up the canal count. They went up 2.9%. They should be going up 10%, 20%. There's a pent-up demand because the traffic is cat. No one knows how long it takes to get, because you can gridlock at any time in the city. If we made the safe cycle network, we would be and could be Copenhagen. And we should be doing that. But that's not a 2% a year increase. It's jump we need to make. And the advantage of that is you could go into the negotiations that we're going to have to do with the European Commission in a few weeks' time and have an answer to the 50 million tonne question, which we don't have an answer to today, it seems to me. Last question I have, or 2 questions. What's the climate emissions of the additional measures that were included in the National Development Plan? What's the total carbon as a result of the new transport projects in the Project Ireland 2040?
That is one of the things that is currently being modelled by, I think, UCC in relation to the impact of the National Development Plan measures on the emissions shortfall that we expect to see.
Why didn't we find that out before we signed off on the plan?
I suppose our focus around the National Development Plan was to get as much investment into transport as we could. We spent a lot of time working very closely with our colleagues across government around this. I think the outcome from a transport perspective was a very, very strong one in terms of much needed investment for all kinds of reasons, economic and specifically around climate change. And we have prioritised heavily shifting investment into public transport. We do have a road network that is there. There's 100,000 kilometres of roads in the country that need to be maintained, and it's really important that our economy remains strong in order to pay for the types of investments that you're talking about, and that's a critical part of that. So our focus to date has been very much on trying to get that investment in, particularly into the key public transport projects that we're trying to deliver.
I leave it at this, Chair, and just to comment that I think the National Planning Framework got it absolutely right. We have to switch to low carbon, we have to switch back to the core. I think the National Development Plan abandoned that. I'd cite Edgar Morgan-Roth, who I think was involved in the early stages of the planning framework, and just about anyone with any climate or transport energy expertise that I talk to says, yeah, the plan, we just went back to the old roads model, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work in gridlock, it's not going to work economically, it's not going to work in emissions. If I can finish by just asking, we didn't get in advance of this meeting, but could I ask a written report back from the department in the next week, if possible, or whenever within the few weeks' time frame we have, asking how much of the 50 million tonne gap you think you're going to be able to provide? Because we have to know that when we're questioning agriculture or the other departments, because we have to know, we have to put it together. So I'd love to get from the department what that figure is and how you think you might deliver it.
On that, we may join, if you don't have those figures and UCC is doing this work, I think we need to call in UCC to our committee, if members are agreeable, to bring them before us.
It's unfair to UCC to expect them to run the transport system.
I think to look, not just transport, this would be all sectors, all departments. Isn't that the research they're carrying out? They're looking at every government department in relation to this research.
Well,
is that your understanding?
It's
every sector,
it's modelling of the energy system.
Yeah.
So in essence, it is proposing, different variables of different measures that can impact on particularly fuel consumption on the transport side and heating consumption, and how they impact upon emissions in the period between 2021 and 2030. Energy use first and then emissions. So it's very difficult. It is very difficult to extract the transport piece from that. It is considered as an overall energy system, and the modelling is conducted on that basis. So I'm not sure that it is going to be feasible to answer the Deputy's question within that time frame. But I would hope that we would be able to do so in the context of the development of the NECP, and as Ireland's national climate pathway is set out, and the interplay between the various different sectors, measures, etc., are all fed in an iterative.
Clarity on that by next month, or when do you see more clarity? I
don't have any visibility at this point of when the results of that modelling work are going to be made available to us. I don't have visibility on that.
Sometime before the European Commission may come in, we're going to have an answer to the question in terms of who's going to do what, in terms of how much of the emissions reduction we're going to do. To be honest, I'm not obsessed with modelling because it's hard to model the future completely. What I'm interested as well is that I cycle down Leeson Street. This is why I got annoyed. I'm sorry about a personal thing. I cycle down Leeson Street every day. I'm nearly killed in a system that's completely car dominated. And the fact that there's more schoolgirls driving themselves to school than they're cycling to school in this country. How could we model? Could we model that we might change that we make it safe for our children to cycle and walk to school, so we don't have 30% of rush hour traffic being kids being driven to school, and we have a diabetes problem and a health problem? Like, it isn't just modelling, it's also vision for the future that creates a city and a country that's attractive to live in and is efficient and works in every way.
Yeah, those points, Deputy, are incredibly well made, and this is why we've worked so hard to try and get this amount of investment allocated across the various things you've talked about, including cycling.
There's nothing's happening.
But Deputy, we've only got the money now, and I don't think it is the case that nothing's happening.
Could I ask you to provide what any extra information that you can over the next few weeks, considering the Deputy, I know other members of the committee, and we will look at UCC ourselves and look at whatever else we can do, because all of this is going towards our report, and we want our report to be as robust and as effective and as meaningful as possible, with clear, concrete decisions and actions that need to be taken. So anything that you and your departments could do to help us in that, if you could provide that in writing to us, would be very much appreciative.
Thanks, Chair. We'll work with the clerk and try and provide.
And if you need to work with other departments, absolutely, because we'll be asking the same. It's not just your department. We'll be asking the same of every other Secretary General that comes before us, every other department. We need this information. Yes, Deputy.
Yeah, can I ask which is the next Secretary General in, Chair?
Housing is coming in next.
I mean, housing is easy because it is, but if we could ask them in advance, what contribution they intend making within that 50 million cut we need to make.
Yeah, we will.
That might frame our debate.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your engagement. It has been excellent here this afternoon. So the Joint Committee is adjourned until next Wednesday, the 10th of October at 2 p.m. Thank you.